Tonight, we're uncovering the twisted story of Criston Cole. There are a few important threads to follow, but I'll keep the pacing soft so you can still drift off comfortably. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment Night 1. Now back to the video. In the year 104 after the conquest, on the grounds of Maidenpool, a young knight with no famous name stepped into the melee and knocked Dark Sister from Prince Daemon Targaryen's hand. It was the sort of moment the nobles of Westeros remembered. Dark Sister was not merely a sword, it was a blade carried by Targaryen princes and queens, an artifact of conquest and old Valyria. To strike it loose with a Morningstar was to make the watching court look twice at the man who had done it. That man was Criston Cole, the son of a steward in the service of House Dondarrion, born among the hard borderlands known as the Dornish Marches. He had no great castle waiting for him, no ancient family tree to recite, and no powerful father arranging his advancement. What he possessed was skill, discipline, and the kind of cool courage that could be noticed in a crowded yard filled with armed men. King Viserys I noticed him. So did the royal family. Within a year, Criston Cole had been raised to the Kingsguard, sworn to wear white, to protect the king and royal blood, and to set aside all private ambition. He was only 23 years old, one of the youngest men ever chosen for that sacred brotherhood. For a time, his rise had the shape of a simple and almost admirable tale. A common-born knight had earned a place beside dragons, through merit alone. Criston was handsome, formidable with sword and Morningstar, and brave enough to face princes without flinching. In a realm where birth often mattered more than worth, he appeared to be proof that ability could still lift a man high. But the higher Criston rose, the more tightly his honor seemed tied to a single person. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was the king's chosen heir, a young woman growing up beneath the gaze of a court, already divided over whether a woman should ever sit the Iron Throne. Criston became her sworn shield and her favored champion. At a later tourney, he asked for her favor before facing Daemon Targaryen. Rhaenyra gave it to him. That small gesture carried weight. A favor might be a ribbon, a token, a public sign of esteem, yet between Criston and Rhaenyra, it came to mean more than ceremony. They spent time together. He trained beside her. She trusted him enough to call him her heart brother. He became part of the private world surrounding the princess, who was meant to inherit the realm. And somewhere within that closeness, Criston's devotion became something more dangerous. The histories do not agree on every private detail. Some accounts emphasize a secret intimacy, others leave more in shadow. Yet the result is difficult to dispute. Criston believed that Rhaenyra had wronged him, and when she chose a future that did not include him, affection hardened into grievance. For a Kingsguard knight, this was a bitter contradiction. He had vowed to abandon marriage, children, lands, and personal claims. Yet he could not abandon the expectation that Rhaenyra should shape her life around his wounded sense of honor. When she did not, Criston treated rejection not as a private sorrow, but as an injury demanding repayment. His white cloak remained spotless in appearance. His loyalties did not. Criston turned toward Queen Alicent Hightower, Rhaenyra's former companion and increasingly her most determined rival. He became Alicent's protector, her trusted sword, and a stern instructor to her sons. The knight who had once worn Rhaenyra's favor began to wear the queen's instead. At Rhaenyra's wedding feast, the change became impossible to ignore. Criston fought Joffrey Lonemouth, a knight close to Rhaenyra's new husband, Laenor Velaryon. The blow he gave Joffrey was so savage that the young knight lingered for 6 days before dying. Whether Criston's rage sprang from insult, jealousy, calculation, or all three, the message was clear enough for the court to understand. The princess and her former champion were no longer merely estranged. They were becoming enemies, and their private bitterness was slowly finding a place inside the struggle for the crown. Years later, when King Viserys died, and the court moved in secret to decide who would rule, Criston Cole would stand at the center of that decision. A reluctant prince named Aegon would be persuaded that he must take the throne or perish beneath Rhaenyra's rule. And it would be Criston, the common-born knight who had once risen by talent and service, who placed the crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon Aegon's head. From that moment, many would call him Criston the Kingmaker. To understand how a common-born knight became the most hated man in Westeros, you have to look closely at the years between the tourney at Maidenpool and the night a crown was placed on a reluctant head. Sir Criston Cole did not wake up one morning as a villain. He became one slowly, through a series of choices that each seemed reasonable at the time, until the sum of them had reshaped the realm. After that first great victory against Prince Daemon, Criston Cole was invited into the royal household. King Viserys saw in him something rare, a warrior whose skill came from practice rather than inheritance. The King's Guard had always been filled with second sons of great houses, men whose names carried weight before their swords ever did. But Criston had no name to carry. He had only his Morningstar and his White Cloak, and for a few years, that seemed to be enough. He was assigned to protect Princess Rhaenyra, the King's chosen heir. At first, this duty was straightforward. He stood guard while she studied, trained beside her in the yard, and accompanied her on rides through the Kingswood. But as the months passed, the distance between protector and protected began to shrink. Rhaenyra was young, intelligent, and isolated by her position. She trusted Criston in a way she trusted few others. She called him her heart brother, a term of affection that carried more weight than either of them may have understood at the time. The turning point came during the Heirs tournament, a grand event held to celebrate Rhaenyra's status as successor. Criston asked for her favor before facing Daemon Targaryen in the melee. She gave it to him, a ribbon or a token, something small that the whole court saw. When Criston defeated Daemon again, the crowd cheered not just for the victory, but for the story it told. A common knight, favored by a princess, proving that merit could still triumph over blood. But stories in Westeros rarely end so cleanly. In the months that followed, something shifted between Criston and Rhaenyra. The histories disagree on exactly what happened, and the most intimate details remain hidden behind the discretion of maesters and the silence of those who were there. What is known is that Criston believed Rhaenyra had led him to expect something she would not give. He had allowed himself to imagine a future that could never exist for a sworn brother of the Kingsguard. And when Rhaenyra chose another path, when she married Laenor Velaryon and began building a life that did not include him, Criston's devotion curdled into something far more dangerous. He did not simply step aside. He did not quietly serve another member of the royal family. Instead, he began to align himself with friend and growing rival. Alicent was the second wife of King Viserys, the mother of his sons, and a woman who had her own reasons to fear what Rhaenyra's inheritance would mean. She welcomed Criston's loyalty. She gave him a purpose that Rhaenyra had taken away. At Rhaenyra's wedding feast, the change became impossible to ignore. Criston wore the green of House Hightower instead of the black and red of House Targaryen. He fought Joffrey Lonemouth, a knight who had spoken in support of Rhaenyra's marriage, and the blow he delivered was so brutal that Joffrey died 6 days later. The court understood what this meant. Criston Cole was no longer Rhaenyra's champion, he was her enemy. From that point forward, Criston dedicated himself to Queen Alicent and her children. He taught Prince Aemon to fight, shaping the boy into a warrior who would one day ride the largest dragon in the world. He stood beside Alicent in the small council chambers, a white cloak in a sea of velvet and gold, his presence a silent reminder that the queen had a sword at her command. And when King Viserys grew old and frail, when his health failed and his mind began to wander, Criston was there, watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when the succession would be decided. That moment came in the year 129 after the conquest. King Viserys died in his sleep, and the realm did not know it yet. The small council met in secret, and Queen Alicent laid out the plan that would change everything. Prince Aegon, her eldest son, must be crowned before Rhaenyra could claim the throne. But Aegon was reluctant. He did not want to be king. He knew the cost of civil war. He had seen what ambition did to families. It was Criston Cole who convinced him. He argued that Rhaenyra would never let Aegon live if she took the throne. He spoke of the danger to Aegon's sons, to his mother, to everyone who had ever supported the Greens. He framed the choice not as ambition, but as survival. And when Aegon finally agreed, it was Criston who placed the crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon his head. From that moment, the realm knew him as Criston the Kingmaker. The common-born knight, who had risen by skill alone, had become the man who broke the peace of the Seven Kingdoms. The Dance of the Dragons had begun, and at its heart was a private wound that had never healed. Criston served as Hand of the King during the war, commanding armies and leading charges. He fought with the same ferocity that had marked his youth, but now his enemies were not opponents in a tourney. They were the men and women who had once been his allies, the family of the princess he had sworn to protect. He did not hesitate. He did not show mercy. The bitterness that had grown inside him for years finally had an outlet, and he used it without restraint. He died in battle, struck by 3 arrows from the bows of House Blackwood archers. The arrows hit his belly, his neck, and his breast. He fell from his horse and was dead before he hit the ground. There was no dramatic final speech, no moment of redemption. He simply stopped being alive, and the war he had helped start continued without him. In the end, Criston Cole is remembered as one of the most hated men in Westerosi history. He is the knight who broke his oath, who turned his back on the princess he had loved, who placed a crown on a head that did not want it, and who lit the fire that burned the realm to ash. But he is also remembered as a man who rose higher than his birth should have allowed, who earned his place through skill and courage, and who might have been a hero if only he had been able to let go of a wound that was never meant to heal. The Dance of the Dragons turned one night's bitterness into a war of dragons. And in the ashes of that war, the scars of his choices would remain for generations, a reminder that even the smallest private grievance, when held too long, can bring down a kingdom. The previous chapter introduced us to Sir Criston Cole, the knight who helped break a kingdom, a brilliant common-born warrior who rose from nothing to become Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, only to end his life as one of the most hated men in all of Westeros. His rise appears almost impossible in a world ruled by bloodlines. So tonight, we go back to the beginning, to understand the man before the legend, before the betrayal, before the war. Criston Cole was born far from the great castles of the realm, in a place that rarely appears on the maps of the powerful. He was the son of a steward serving House Dondarrion, a minor household in a region known as the Dornish Marches. This is a hard frontier, a land where old enemies and old violence shape men early. For centuries, the Marches have been the buffer zone between the Stormlands and Dorne, a place where raids and skirmishes were not events but a way of life. Every stone keep, every village, every family carried the memory of some border war, some forgotten feud, some blood debt that had never been settled. To be born here was to understand, from the very first breath, that the world was not safe, that comfort was a luxury, and that survival depended on strength, vigilance, and the willingness to fight. Criston possessed no famous family name, no inheritance, and no obvious path to courtly power. His father was not a lord, not a knight, but a servant, a man who managed the lands and accounts of another. In a society that measured a man's worth by his ancestors, Criston began with nothing, no sigil, no words, no legacy to call upon. The great houses of Westeros, the Targaryens, the Lannisters, the Starks, they were not just families, they were dynasties, built on centuries of privilege, alliances, and carefully guarded bloodlines. Criston Cole had none of that. He was a commoner in a world that despised commoners, a world where the only way to rise was to be noticed, and the only way to be noticed was to be exceptional. His only inheritance was martial skill, discipline, and a hunger to rise. From a young age, he learned to handle a sword, to ride a horse, to endure the harsh training that the Marches demanded of their sons. There was no grand academy, no master-at-arms of legendary reputation. There was only the practical, brutal education of a frontier, where a mistake in a sparring match could cost you a finger, and a mistake in a real fight could cost you everything. He learned to read the land, to anticipate an ambush, to fight with whatever weapon was at hand. The Morningstar, a weapon of brutal simplicity, became his signature. It was not the elegant blade of a tourney knight, but the tool of a man who needed to break armor, to shatter shields, to end a fight decisively. This was the weapon of a man who could not afford to lose. And so, the boy from the Marches, the steward's son, began to carve a path through the only avenue available to him, his own skill. He became a squire, then a knight, earning his spurs not through birthright, but through proven ability on the field. In a world of lords and heirs, he was an anomaly, a man who had to fight for every step, who had to be twice as good, twice as disciplined, twice as ruthless, just to be noticed. And he was noticed. The lords of the Marches, men who had seen countless soldiers come and go, recognized something in Criston Cole, a coldness, a focus, a hunger that could not be satisfied by a simple knighthood. This hunger, this drive, was the engine of his rise, but it was also the seed of his destruction. For a man who has clawed his way up from nothing, the fear of falling back into nothing is a constant gnawing presence. Every victory is temporary, every position is precarious, every alliance is conditional. A man like Criston Cole could never rest. He could never trust. He could never afford to be vulnerable. And that, more than any sword or Morningstar, would define his fate. As he grew into a warrior of considerable reputation, his name began to travel beyond the borders of the Marches. Whispers of a common-born knight, a man of unmatched ferocity and discipline, reached the ears of the great houses. And it was this reputation that would eventually bring him to the attention of the crown, to a tournament that would change everything. For now he was still a man of the frontier, a son of the Marches, shaped by violence and ambition, waiting for his moment. And that moment was coming, carried on the winds of a changing realm. The Dornish Marches shaped Criston Cole long before he ever held a sword for a king. This was a land where survival depended on skill rather than name, where the constant threat of Dornish raiders meant that a man's worth was measured by what he could do with his hands. And in this hard country, a boy who would one day be called the Kingmaker was learning lessons that no lord's son could ever understand. Criston's father served as steward for Lord Dondarrion, a position of trust but not of blood. The boy grew up in the shadow of Blackhaven's walls, watching the knights train in the yard, studying the way they moved, the way they held their shields, the way they killed. He had no claim to nobility, no inheritance waiting for him, no name that would open doors. What he had was hunger, and in the Marches, that was enough. When the time came, Criston earned his knighthood the old way, not through favor or family connection, but through proven ability. A knight made him, some say a hedge knight, others claim a lord of the Marches who saw something rare in the young man's eyes. The details are lost, but the result is not. But Sir Criston Cole entered the world of chivalry as an outsider, a common-born man who had fought his way into a station reserved for the highborn, and he carried that weight with him always. His fighting style reflected his origins. This was not the elegant swordplay of the tourney grounds, the kind of dance that court knights performed for ladies in silk. Criston Cole fought like a man who expected to die. He favoured the sword and the Morningstar, weapons of brutal practicality. The Morningstar, with its spiked head on a chain, required strength and timing, but it could crush armour, and shatter bones in a way that a blade could not. It was a weapon for men who needed results, not applause. Those who saw him fight described a warrior who moved with a kind of controlled violence. Every strike aimed at ending the fight as quickly as possible. He did not waste motion. He did not show off. He simply destroyed whatever stood before him. And in a world where knights often dressed more for ceremony than for battle, Criston Cole looked like a man shaped by actual danger. His armor bore the marks of real combat, not the polished shine of a court favorite. His hands were calloused. His eyes held the weight of someone who had seen what steel does to flesh. Word of his skill spread slowly at first, traveling through the keeps and villages of the Marches, carried by merchants and soldiers who had witnessed his work. But eventually, that reputation reached the one place that mattered most: King's Landing. The timing could not have been more perfect. The royal court was seeking fresh champions. King Viserys I had recently taken the throne, and with a new reign came a need for new faces, new swords, new men who could represent the crown with honor and strength. The Kingsguard, the legendary order of 7 White Cloaks sworn to protect the king, had openings. And the lords of the court were always looking for warriors who could win glory in the tourneys that marked the beginning of a new era. Criston Cole arrived in the capital as an unknown, a common knight from a hard land, carrying a Morningstar and a reputation for winning. He did not have the blood of old Valyria in his veins. He did not have a great house behind him. He had only his skill, his will, and the knowledge that in the world of kings and princes, a man like him would never get a second chance. The Maidenpool tourney of 104 after the conquest would change everything. It was held to celebrate the ascension of King Viserys, and the finest knights from across the realm gathered to compete. Lords and landed knights, men with names that stretched back thousands of years, all came to prove themselves in the melee and the joust. And among them stood Sir Criston Cole, the steward's son, the knight of the Marches, the man who had earned everything he had through blood and iron. In the melee, he faced Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's own brother, a warrior of legendary skill who carried Dark Sister, the blade of Visenya Targaryen herself. Daemon was everything Criston was not: royal, privileged, born to power. And in that moment, the common knight from the Marches did the impossible. He knocked Dark Sister from Daemon's hand with his Morningstar, a blow that echoed through the tournament grounds and sent shockwaves through the court. The prince was humiliated, the crowd was stunned, and Criston Cole had announced himself to the realm in the most dramatic way possible. He was no longer an unknown. He was the man who had beaten Daemon Targaryen, and in a world that valued martial prowess above almost everything else, that meant something. King Viserys took notice, the small council took notice, and soon, the white cloak that Criston had dreamed of was within reach. He had come to King's Landing as a stranger, a common-born knight with nothing but his reputation, but that reputation had grown into something that even the highborn could not ignore. The court needed champions, and Criston Cole had proven that he was exactly that. The path to the Kingsguard was opening before him, but the road ahead would demand more than just skill with a sword. It would require navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, where a man's enemies were not always the ones carrying steel, and it would bring him into the orbit of 2 women who would define the rest of his life, Princess Rhaenyra and Queen Alicent, though he did not yet know the price that would come with their attention. For now, though, Criston Cole was simply a knight who had earned his place through ability, a man who looked like he had been forged in danger rather than born into comfort, and a warrior whose brutal practicality would soon become legend. The capital had found its new champion, and the story of the Kingmaker was only beginning. The tourney at Maidenpool, in 104 AC, was meant to be a celebration. King Viserys I had ascended the Iron Throne only a year prior, and the realm was still learning the shape of his rule. He was a man who preferred peace, who wanted to bind the great houses together with feasts and favors rather than fear. So the tourney was grand as any the Riverlands had seen in years. Knights came from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, eager to prove themselves before the new king and his court. The lists were filled with the sons of lords, landed knights, and champions of famous houses. But among them, unknown to nearly everyone, was a young knight from the Dornish Marches named Criston Cole. He had earned his knighthood the hard way, not through birth, not through a father's name, but through sheer ability, with sword and Morningstar. He was a man built for the melee, for the chaos of close combat, where reach and speed mattered more than lineage. The Dornish Marches had taught him that. It was a land of constant vigilance, where raiders from Dawn and Stormlanders alike tested the borders with steel. A man who could not fight there did not survive long. Criston had survived. He had thrived, and now he stood in the shadow of the royal pavilion, watching the greatest warriors of the age prepare for the melee. The field at Maidenpool was vast, ringed by wooden barriers and crowded with banners. The sun was high, and the dust from the practice yards hung in the air. The melee was the main event of the tourney, a free-for-all where knights fought in teams or alone until only one remained standing. It was a brutal spectacle, but it was also the surest way for an unknown knight to make a name, and Criston Cole intended to make his name known. He faced opponents of considerable skill that day. He cut through them methodically, his Morningstar swinging in wide arcs that kept his enemies at a distance. The weapon was not elegant. It was not the choice of a man who cared for pageantry. It was a weapon of pure function, a spiked ball on a chain that could crush armor and shatter bones. And Criston wielded it with a precision that surprised those who watched. He moved through the melee like a man who had been fighting his whole life, because he had. But the true test came when he found himself face to face with Prince Daemon Targaryen. Daemon was the king's younger brother, a man known across the realm as the most dangerous royal warrior of his generation. He had fought in the Stepstones, had led men into battle, and had a reputation for cruelty and brilliance in equal measure. He carried Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had belonged to Visenya Targaryen, a sword as sharp as it was legendary. Daemon was not just a prince. He was a force of nature on the battlefield, and everyone in the crowd knew it. The melee had thinned by the time they met. The dust had settled enough that the crowd could see clearly. Criston stood with his Morningstar low, the chain wrapped around his forearm. Daemon circled him, Dark Sister glinting in the afternoon light. The prince smiled. He was confident, as he always was. He had never met a knight from the Dornish Marches who could match him. He lunged. The first exchange was fast. Daemon's blade sliced through the air where Criston had been standing a moment before. Criston pivoted, the Morningstar coming up in a tight arc. It caught Dark Sister on the chain, deflecting the blow. The sound of metal on metal rang out across the field. Daemon recovered quickly, pressing the attack with a series of strikes that would have felled a lesser fighter. But Criston did not retreat. He absorbed each blow, turning them aside with the chain of his Morningstar, or dodging at the last possible moment. The crowd grew quiet. They had expected the prince to win easily. They had expected a quick end to this unknown knight's run. But Criston Cole was not playing the part of a stepping stone. He was fighting like a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Daemon grew frustrated. He was not used to being matched. He feinted high and then swept low, aiming for Criston's legs. Criston jumped the blade and in the same motion brought the Morningstar down in a heavy overhand strike. Daemon raised Dark Sister to block, but the Morningstar's chain wrapped around the blade. For a moment, the two men were locked together, each straining against the other. Then Criston twisted his wrist, and the Morningstar pulled Dark Sister from Daemon's grip. The Valyrian steel sword clattered to the ground. The crowd gasped. It was a sound that seemed to come from a single throat, a collective intake of breath that swept through the stands. Prince Daemon Targaryen, the realm's most dangerous royal warrior, stood disarmed before a knight no one had ever heard of. His face went pale, then red. He stared at Dark Sister lying in the dust, and then at Criston Cole, who did not press the advantage. The melee was over for both of them, in a way. Criston had won the exchange, and everyone knew it. The unknown knight had humiliated a prince, and the court suddenly knew his name. Criston Cole did not celebrate. He did not raise his arms or shout. He simply stood there, breathing hard, the Morningstar still in his hand. He had done what no one expected. He had beaten the prince. But in that moment, he also understood something else. He had made an enemy. Daemon Targaryen was not a man who forgot humiliation, and the court, which had been silent, now buzzed with whispers. Who was this knight? Where had he come from? And what would become of him now? King Viserys himself took notice. He summoned Criston to the royal pavilion after the melee, and there, before the assembled lords and ladies, he offered the young knight a place in the king's guard. It was an honour beyond anything Criston could have dreamed. The White Cloak was the highest symbol of trust and loyalty a knight could wear, and for a common-born man from the Dornish Marches, it was almost unheard of. But Viserys saw something in him. He saw a man who could be trusted, a man who had proven his skill and his restraint in the same breath. Criston accepted. He knelt before the king and swore his oaths. The White Cloak was placed around his shoulders, and he became a sworn brother of the Kingsguard. It was the beginning of a new life, a life that would take him far from the dusty fields of the Marches and into the heart of the royal court. But the seeds of his twisted fate were already being sown. The favour he had won at Maidenpool, the attention of the king, the enmity of the prince. All of these would shape the man he was becoming. The court soon learned that Criston Cole was not just a skilled fighter. He was a man of quiet intensity, of deep loyalty, and of a pride that ran just beneath the surface. He wore the White Cloak with a seriousness that impressed some and unsettled others. He kept to himself, training in the yards, learning the ways of the Red Keep. He did not seek favour or friendship. He simply served. But the court was a place of shifting alliances and hidden desires, and Criston Cole, for all his discipline, was about to be drawn into a relationship that would change everything. The Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's only living child and the heir to the Iron Throne, had noticed him at the tourney. She had seen him defeat Daemon. She had seen him kneel before her father, and she was intrigued. The morning after Criston Cole unseated Prince Daemon Targaryen and sent Dark Sister spinning across the tourney field, the realm began to learn his name. But one person noticed him before the dust had even settled. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was only 15 years old in the year 104 after the conquest. She had been named heir to the Iron Throne just a few months earlier, a decision that still sent whispers through every hall in the Red Keep. Her father, King Viserys I, had chosen her over his brother Daemon, and the weight of that choice pressed down on her shoulders every single day. She was young, restless, and already burdened by the title of heir in ways that no one her age should have to understand. The tourney at Maidenpool was meant to celebrate her father's accession, but for Rhaenyra, it was something else entirely. It was a parade of suitors, a marketplace of lords and knights, all hoping to catch her eye, all calculating what a match with the realm's future queen might mean for their houses. Every lance that splintered, every cheer that rose from the crowd, carried with it the unspoken question of who would be worthy enough to stand beside her, and she knew it. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the careful smiles, the rehearsed courtesies. It was suffocating. Then Criston Cole stepped into the lists. He was not like the others. He did not ride beneath the banners of a great house. He carried no ancient name, no vast lands, no treasury of gold to offer. He was a knight of the Dornish Marches, a son of a steward, a man who had earned his spurs through skill and sweat rather than inheritance. And when he faced Prince Daemon, the most dangerous warrior in the Seven Kingdoms, he did not flinch. He did not negotiate. He simply fought. The Morningstar was not a weapon of elegance. It was brutal, direct and final. When it connected with Daemon's sword hand and sent Dark Sister tumbling into the dirt, the crowd fell silent for a single breath before erupting. Rhaenyra watched from the royal box, and something shifted in her chest. Criston's victory gave her a champion, unlike the polished lords competing for royal favour. He was not performing for her. He was not angling for a betrothal or a grant of land. He had fought because that was what he did, because he was a knight, because the melee was the only language he truly spoke, and in that moment he became hers in a way that no lord with a marriage contract ever could. Their connection began in the glow of tourneys, where admiration can feel more intimate than love. In the days that followed, Rhaenyra found reasons to be near him. She watched him train. She listened to the other knights speak of his victories. She noticed the way he carried himself, not with the arrogance of the highborn, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had proven himself again and again against odds that should have broken him. For Rhaenyra, Criston offered loyalty without the suffocating calculations of dynastic marriage. When she spoke to him, he listened. When she asked his opinion, he gave it honestly. He did not try to impress her with promises of alliances or claims to distant castles. He simply stood beside her, a shield made of flesh and steel, and that was enough. The court began to take notice. Whispers followed them through the corridors of the Red Keep. Some said the princess favoured the Dornish knight too openly. Others said it was harmless, the infatuation of a young girl who had never been allowed to simply choose someone for herself. But Rhaenyra did not care. She had spent her entire life being told what she must become, who she must marry, how she must rule. In Criston Cole, she saw something rare, a man who had chosen his own path and would walk it without apology. And so, in the warm evenings of that first tournament season, beneath the banners and the torchlight, the princess and the knight began to build something that would shape the fate of a kingdom. She gave him her favour. He gave her his word, and neither of them yet understood how fragile such things could be. The bond between them deepened over the following years. Criston became a fixture in Rhaenyra's life, teaching her younger brothers to fight, standing guard during her walks through the gardens, offering counsel when the weight of the crown grew too heavy. He was her protector, her confidant, her heart brother, as she would later call him. And for a time, it seemed as though the world had finally given her something that belonged only to her. But the court of King Viserys was a place where nothing stayed pure for long. Queen Alicent Hightower, the king's second wife and Rhaenyra's former friend, watched the growing closeness between the princess and the knight with an eye that saw opportunity where others saw only sentiment. And in the shadows, the seeds of division were already being sown, watered by jealousy, ambition, and the slow poison of a broken heart that had not yet learned to break. The tourney at Maidenpool had been the first real glimpse the realm had of Sir Criston Cole. He had arrived as an unknown, a hedge knight from the Dornish Marches with no name to speak of and no patron to champion him. He left having unhorsed Daemon Targaryen, having won the melee, having caught the eye of the princess herself. But a single victory, even one so spectacular, does not guarantee a future. For a man of Cole's birth, the path forward was still narrow, still uncertain. He could have remained a tawny knight, chasing purses and glory from one field to the next, slowly fading into the background of history. Instead, something far more extraordinary happened. In the year 105 after Aegon's conquest, King Viserys I made a decision that would reshape the course of the realm. He needed new members for his Kingsguard, the 7 sworn brothers who protected the royal family with their lives. And among those chosen, at only 23 years old, was Sir Criston Cole. The appointment was an extraordinary elevation for the son of a steward. The Kingsguard was not a position typically open to men of common blood. It was a brotherhood of knights from noble houses, men whose names carried weight and whose families had served the crown for generations. To be admitted into that order was to be lifted above your station entirely. For Cole, it meant stepping out of the shadow of obscurity and into the direct light of the Iron Throne. The White Cloak is one of the most powerful symbols in Westeros, It is a garment of absolute honor, a declaration that the man who wears it has set aside all personal ambition, all family ties, all earthly desires, in service to the king. For a common-born knight, it was also a kind of transformation. Cole was no longer just the son of a steward from the Dornish Marches. He was a sworn brother of the Kingsguard, a man whose word carried the weight of the crown itself. The White Cloak gave him honor, proximity to the royal family, and a place beside Rhaenyra. He was now a constant presence in her life, not as a suitor or a champion from a distance, but as one of her protectors. He would stand at her side during feasts, ride with her on royal progresses, and train with her in the yard. For a young woman who had grown tired of the endless parade of lords and princes vying for her favour, Cole represented something different. He was not a politician. He was not manoeuvring for lands or titles. He was a warrior, plain and direct, and she trusted him. But the White Cloak is also a binding. It is a vow that cannot be broken without consequence. The Kingsguard swear to take no wife, to father no children, to hold no lands, and to live and die for the king. These are not abstract promises. They are the walls of a cage, and once the cloak is placed upon your shoulders, you are inside it for life. For Criston Cole, these vows would become the source of his deepest shame and fury. He did not know it yet, standing in the throne room of the Red Keep, receiving the White Cloak from the king's own hands. He did not know that the very honor he was accepting would one day feel like a chain around his throat. He was young, he was proud, and he believed in the words he swore. In the months that followed, Cole settled into his role. He trained with the other knights of the Kingsguard, men like Sir Harold Westerling, the Lord Commander, a veteran whose loyalty was beyond question. Cole learned the rhythms of the Red Keep, the corridors and courtyards, the schedules of the royal family, the unspoken rules of court life. He was a quick study, and his skill with a blade earned him respect among his brothers. But it was his relationship with the princess that set him apart. Rhaenyra sought his company more than she sought the company of the other knights. She asked him to spar with her, to teach her the techniques he had used against Daemon. She listened when he spoke, and she laughed at his dry observations about the lords who flattered her father. In her eyes, he was not just a guard, he was a friend. And for Cole, she was becoming something more. He was careful at first. He knew the boundaries of his station. He knew the weight of his vows. But the line between duty and desire is thin. And for a man who had spent his life fighting for every scrap of recognition, the attention of a princess was intoxicating. He began to see himself not as a servant of the crown, but as a man who might deserve a place in her story. He began to believe that the White Cloak was not a cage, but a foundation upon which something greater could be built. The court of King Viserys was not a simple place. It was filled with whispers and factions, with old grudges and new alliances. The king himself was a man who preferred peace to confrontation, who tried to please everyone, and often pleased no one. His council was dominated by the hand of the king, Sir Otto Hightower, a man of cold calculation and long memory. Otto had a daughter, Alicent, who had been a close friend of Rhaenyra since childhood. But the dynamics of the court were shifting. Viserys had lost his first wife, Aemma Arryn, in a brutal childbirth that had also claimed their son. The king had remarried, and his new wife was Alicent Hightower. This marriage had changed everything. The princess, once the undisputed heir, now had a stepmother who was her own age, and a half-brother, Aegon, who had been born in the same year as Cole's appointment to the Kingsguard. The presence of a male heir complicated Rhaenyra's position. There were those who whispered that a woman could not sit the Iron Throne, that the realm would never accept a queen when a true-born prince existed. Otto Hightower was among those whisperers, though he was careful never to say so aloud. He positioned his daughter and his grandson as the true future of the dynasty, and he watched for any weakness in the princess's defense. Into this web of tension stepped Criston Cole. He was not a player of the game. He was a knight, trained to see enemies in front of him, not behind. He did not understand the subtle poison of courtly ambition, The way a word spoken in the right ear could destroy a reputation. The way a favour granted could become a debt collected. He only understood loyalty, and his loyalty was to Rhaenyra. But loyalty, like the White Cloak, can become a burden. The closer Cole grew to the princess, the more he became a target. Otto Hightower noted the knight's influence over Rhaenyra. He noted the way she trusted him, the way she deferred to his judgment in matters of training and protection. To Otto, this was a vulnerability. A common-born knight could be manipulated, could be turned, could be used as a weapon against the princess if the right pressure was applied, and Otto was patient. He did not move quickly. He waited, watching for the moment when Cole's loyalty might crack. For now, though, the court was at peace. The king was content. The princess was young and free, and Sir Criston Cole wore his white with pride. Unaware of the storm that was gathering on the horizon, he stood beside Rhaenyra at feasts, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He trained with her in the yard, correcting her stance, praising her speed. He was her protector, her teacher, her friend. And in the quiet moments, when the court was asleep and the torches burned low in the corridors, he allowed himself to imagine a future that his vows forbade. He imagined a life in which the White Cloak was not the end of his story, but the beginning of something else entirely. But vows are not wishes. They are iron, and they do not bend. The White Cloak that had lifted Criston Cole from obscurity would one day become the weight that pulled him down. The honour that had made him would also break him, and the princess who had given him a purpose would become the source of his deepest wound. For now, though, the year was 105. The king was alive, the realm was stable, and the son of a steward stood in the light of the Iron Throne, wearing the white of the King's Guard, believing that he had found his place in the world. He had not yet learned that the highest honours often carry the heaviest prices. He had not yet learned that the path of honour is sometimes the path to ruin. He was young, and he was proud, and he was about to discover that the vows he had sworn were not just promises to a king. They were chains that would bind him to a fate he could not yet see. The White Cloak settled on Criston Cole's shoulders in the year 105. And with it came a duty that would define the rest of his life. He was now a sworn brother of the King's Guard, bound by sacred oath to protect the king and his family with his very life. But for a young man who had risen from the dust of the Dornish Marches to the marble halls of the Red Keep, the most important member of that family was not yet the king. It was the king's daughter. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was only 8 years old when Criston took his vows. She was a child of fire and restlessness, the only living child of King Viserys, and already the realm's designated heir. The court of King's Landing was a place of endless ceremony and careful politics. But Rhaenyra was not easily contained. She rode her dragon, Syrax, with a wildness that worried her father's counsellors. She spoke her mind in chambers, where women were expected to remain silent, and she was lonely. The weight of her title isolated her from other children, and the adults around her were either scheming for favour or bowing in deference. What she needed was someone who would simply stand beside her, without pretense. Criston Cole became that person. It happened gradually, as such things often do. In the beginning, he was simply the knight assigned to guard her chambers, to accompany her on walks through the gardens, to stand silent watch while she took her lessons. But Rhaenyra was perceptive. She noticed that Criston did not flatter her. He did not try to win her favour with empty words or elaborate gifts. He simply did his duty, quietly and competently, and when she spoke to him, he answered with honesty. For a princess surrounded by sycophants, honesty was a rare and precious thing. As the years passed, their bond deepened. Criston taught Rhaenyra to handle a blade, not for combat, but for the discipline and confidence it gave her. He accompanied her on rides beyond the city walls, where they could speak without the ears of the court pressing in. He became her confidant, the one person she trusted to hear her frustrations about her father's indecision, her stepmother's coldness, and the endless pressure to produce an heir. In the histories that would later be written, some scribes would refer to Criston Cole as Rhaenyra's heart-brother. It was a term of deep affection, suggesting a bond that transcended the formal roles of knight and princess. They were not blood, but they were family in the way that truly matters. But this closeness was not without its dangers. Criston Cole was a knight of the Kingsguard, sworn to a life of chastity and absolute devotion to his vows. Rhaenyra was a princess of the realm, destined for a political marriage that would secure alliances and produce heirs. The line between duty and affection began to blur, and with it, the line between what was permitted and what was forbidden. A knight sworn to chastity and a princess promised to a political future were walking toward disaster, and neither of them seemed willing to look away. In the quiet moments when the torches burned low and the castle fell silent, there were glances that lingered a moment too long. There were words that carried more weight than simple conversation. The court, ever watchful, began to notice. Whispers spread through the corridors. Speculation about the nature of the relationship between the princess and her sworn shield. Some dismissed it as idle gossip, the kind of rumour that always surrounded the powerful, but others saw the truth, or at least a version of it. They saw a young woman who trusted a man completely, and a man who had given her his entire heart. The tragedy of Criston Cole is not that he loved Rhaenyra. The tragedy is that he loved her in a world that could never allow that love to exist in peace. Every moment of closeness was a step closer to a breaking point. Every whispered confidence was a thread pulled from the fabric of his oath. And when that breaking point finally came, it would not be gentle. It would shatter everything. For now, though, in these early years of their bond, there was still a fragile peace. Rhaenyra had her heart-brother, and Criston had his princess. They walked the halls of the Red Keep together, two figures bound by loyalty, and something deeper, something unnamed. The disaster was still ahead, waiting in the shadows of the future. But in the light of the present, there was only the quiet warmth of a friendship that should never have been, and could never last. By the time the Heir's tournament was announced, Criston Cole had already become a familiar presence at Rhaenyra's side. He was her sworn shield, a teacher, a constant companion in the training yard and at court. But the tournament held to celebrate her formal recognition as heir to the Iron Throne would test that bond in ways neither of them could have predicted. The lists were set in the great field outside King's Landing, the stands packed with lords and ladies from across the realm. King Viserys had called this gathering to affirm his daughter's succession, to display the unity of the realm behind the first woman ever named heir to the Iron Throne. But tournaments, as everyone knew, were rarely about unity. They were about glory, about pride, about the quiet humiliations that could fester for years beneath the surface of chivalry. Criston entered the lists with the White Cloak of the Kingsguard streaming behind him. He was no longer the unknown knight from the Dornish Marches who had stunned the court at Maidenpool. Now he was a known quantity, a man whose skill with sword and Morningstar had earned him a place among the realm's finest warriors. And yet, there was something different about him. This time, he fought with a focused intensity that bordered on fury, as if each opponent was not merely a challenger, but an obstacle to something he desperately wanted. The crowd roared as he unhorsed one knight after another. The dust rose in clouds, the sound of steel on steel echoing off the castle walls. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Prince Daemon Targaryen, the king's own brother, the rogue prince who had once been heir himself, rode into the lists to face Criston Cole. Daemon was everything Criston was not. He was royal blood, dragon rider, a man who had spent his life in the shadow of a throne he believed should have been his. He carried Dark Sister, the legendary Valyrian steel blade, and he fought with the arrogance of a man who had never truly been tested. But Criston had tested him once before, at Maidenpool, and he would test him again. The joust was brutal. Daemon's lance struck Criston's shield with enough force to splinter wood, but Criston held his seat. When they met again, Criston's lance caught Daemon square in the chest, sending the prince tumbling from his horse in a crash of armor and dust. The crowd gasped. Daemon lay on the ground for a long moment, his pride wounded far more than his body. He rose slowly, his eyes burning with a hatred that would never cool. But Criston was not finished. He dismounted and drew his sword, challenging Daemon to a melee. The prince accepted, and the two men fought before the entire court. It was a brutal display of skill and rage. Daemon was faster, more experienced, but Criston was younger and driven by something Daemon could not match. In the end, Criston disarmed the prince, sending Dark Sister spinning into the dirt. Daemon stood defenseless, his humiliation complete. The crowd erupted. King Viserys smiled from the royal box, but Criston's eyes were not on the king. They were on Rhaenyra. He walked toward her, his armor dented and covered in dust, his sword still drawn. The crowd fell silent, uncertain of what he intended. And then, in full view of the court, Criston Cole knelt before the princess. He laid his sword at her feet and asked for her favor. The gesture was small by the customs of chivalry. A knight asking a lady for her favor before a tournament was common enough, but this was different. This was a public declaration. Criston was not just asking for a token. He was declaring himself her champion, her protector, her servant, in a way that went beyond the vows of the Kingsguard. Rhaenyra looked at him for a long moment. The court held its breath, and then she reached up and removed a ribbon from her hair, a simple piece of silk, and handed it to him. Criston took it and pressed it to his lips. The crowd cheered, but not everyone was pleased. Daemon watched from the edge of the field, his face a mask of cold fury. He had been humiliated before the entire realm, and by a common-born knight no less. The rivalry between them was no longer a matter of sport. It was personal, it was venomous, and it would poison the royal household for years to come. In the days that followed, the court buzzed with gossip. The ribbon, that simple piece of silk, became a symbol of something far greater. Some said Criston had overstepped his station. Others whispered that the princess had given him more than just a favor. The gesture was enormous in the language of court intrigue. A signal that Criston Cole was no ordinary knight. He was Rhaenyra's chosen champion. That meant he was a threat to everyone who sought her favor. Criston wore the ribbon into every subsequent tilt, every melee, every public display of arms. He fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, as if he was trying to prove something, not just to the court, but to himself. And Rhaenyra watched him from the royal box, her eyes following his every move. But the bond between them was already beginning to fray. The tournament had elevated Criston in the eyes of the realm, but it had also placed him in a position he could not sustain. He was a common-born knight in a world of lords and princes. He was a sworn brother of the Kingsguard, bound by oath to serve the king above all others, and he was falling in love with the princess he was sworn to protect. The seeds of tragedy were sown in that moment of triumph. Criston had won the tournament, had defeated Daemon, had claimed Rhaenyra's favour before the entire court, but he had also made enemies. Daemon would never forgive the humiliation. The lords who had hoped to win Rhaenyra's hand would resent the upstart knight, and the court itself would begin to whisper, to watch, to wait for the moment when Criston Cole would inevitably fall. For now, though, the victory was sweet. Criston walked through the halls of the Red Keep, with Rhaenyra's ribbon tied to his arm, a visible reminder of her favour. He trained with her sons, taught them the art of the sword, and stood guard outside her chambers. He was her protector, her confidant, her heart-brother, but the ribbon was also a chain, binding him to a path that would lead him far from the man he had once been. The Heirs tournament was the high point of Criston Cole's early life. It was the moment when he stood at the centre of the realm, beloved by the princess, feared by her enemies, and respected by all who witnessed his skill. But it was also the moment when the cracks began to show. The rivalry with Daemon would fester, the whispers of the court would grow louder, and the ribbon, that simple piece of silk, would become a symbol of everything Criston had gained and everything he was about to lose. And so, after that tournament, after Criston Cole had once again bested Prince Daemon Targaryen and received Princess Rhaenyra's favour before the entire court, the question becomes what happened next. What happened between them when the crowds dispersed and the banners were taken down, and the two of them were no longer performing for the realm? The histories disagree on what truly passed between Criston and Rhaenyra behind closed doors, and this disagreement is not a minor footnote. It is the central uncertainty of his entire story. Some accounts suggest a sexual relationship. They describe a knight who was not merely devoted but intimate, a man who shared the princess's bed and believed that this intimacy meant something permanent. In these versions, Criston Cole was not just Rhaenyra's sworn protector, he was her lover. And he expected that this bond would translate into something more than secret meetings in the shadows of the Red Keep. He expected to be chosen. He expected that the princess who had given him her favour, who had called him her champion, would not cast him aside when a more advantageous match presented itself. But other accounts preserve a more ambiguous, unfulfilled devotion. In these tellings, the relationship between Criston and Rhaenyra was intense but never consummated. It was a love that existed entirely in the space between what was said and what was left unsaid. Criston adored her. He would have died for her. He may have believed that she adored him in return, but the physical act never occurred. And the tragedy lies not in betrayal, but in misunderstanding. He wanted something she could not give, and she may never have realised how much he wanted it until it was too late. What remains consistent across all versions is that Criston wants something Rhaenyra cannot or will not give him, whether that something is her hand in marriage, her exclusive loyalty, her acknowledgement of their bond in the eyes of the court, or simply her love in a form that matches his own intensity. The result is the same. He reaches for her and she pulls away. He offers everything and she offers something less. And for a man like Criston Cole, a man who rose from nothing through sheer skill and will, a man who believed that merit should be rewarded with recognition, this refusal is not just a disappointment, it is a wound that never heals. The uncertainty deepens the tragedy, because the consequences are certain, even if the truth is not. We may never know exactly what happened in those private chambers. We may never know whether Rhaenyra made promises she later broke, or whether Criston imagined promises that were never made. But we know what happened next. We know that the man who had been her champion became her enemy. We know that the knight who had worn her favour began to wear another woman's colours. And we know that the love, whatever form it took, curdled into something that would help tear the realm apart. So the question lingers, not because historians enjoy ambiguity, but because the ambiguity itself is the point. Criston Cole's story is not one of simple villainy or simple heroism. It is a story of a man who loved someone who could not love him back in the way he needed, and who let that failure define the rest of his life. And as the court of King Viserys continued its slow dance toward disaster, the rift between the princess and her former champion grew wider, pulling others into its wake. The next chapter of that rift would involve a wedding, a joust, and a death that no one could have predicted. And so the wedding of Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen to Sir Lyonor Velaryon was meant to be a triumph. It was meant to bind two great houses together, to secure the succession, to prove that the realm could unite behind the king's chosen heir. But for Criston Cole, that wedding was not a celebration, it was a funeral. It was the moment when every hope he had carried, every secret dream he had nurtured in the quiet hours of the night, was buried alive. He stood in the sept as the septon spoke the words, as Rhaenyra and Lyonor joined hands, and he felt the floor fall away beneath him. He had watched her grow from a girl into a woman. He had bled for her, fought for her, humiliated himself for her, and now she was giving herself to a man who could not even look at her with desire. That was the cruelest part. Lyonor Velaryon was a good man, a brave knight, but his heart belonged elsewhere to other men. to a love that could never be spoken aloud in the court of King Viserys. And yet Rhaenyra chose him. She chose a hollow marriage over the man who had offered her everything. Criston did not understand. He could not understand. And in his pain, he did what broken men have always done. He turned his grief into rage. The joust that followed the wedding feast was supposed to be a diversion, a moment of sport to lift the spirits of the court. But for Criston Cole, it became a battlefield of a different kind. He rode into the lists not as a champion seeking glory, but as a man seeking blood. He unhorsed night after night, his lance finding its mark with a precision that spoke of something darker than skill. And then he faced Sir Joffrey Lonmouth, Laenor's lover, the man who had been chosen for the love that Criston had been denied. The tilt was brutal. Criston did not simply defeat Joffrey, he destroyed him. The blow that struck Joffrey's helm was not a sporting strike, it was an execution. The crowd gasped as Joffrey fell, as the blood pooled beneath his shattered visor, as the silence of the tawny ground swallowed the cheers. And when Criston dismounted, when he looked at the body of the man he had just killed, he did not show remorse, he showed satisfaction. He had taken something from Laenor, something precious, something that could never be returned. And in that act of violence, he had declared war not just on Rhaenyra, but on everything she had chosen over him. The realm would remember that day. They would remember the blood on the sand, the screaming of the crowd, the cold fury in Criston Cole's eyes. And they would remember that the rift between the princess and her former champion had claimed its first victim, but it would not be the last. The wound that Criston carried would fester, and in time it would infect the entire realm. The Dance of Dragons was still years away, but the first steps had been taken on that bloody tawny ground, in the shadow of a wedding that should have united a kingdom, but instead tore two hearts apart forever. The histories disagree on what truly passed between Criston and Rhaenyra behind closed doors. Some accounts suggest a sexual relationship, while others preserve a more ambiguous, unfulfilled devotion. But regardless of what actually happened, the aftermath is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because in one account, Criston proposes something that would change everything. He asks Rhaenyra to abandon court entirely and flee with him across the narrow sea. Think about what that means for a moment. Criston Cole, the son of a steward, a man who had risen from the Dornish Marches to become a knight of the Kingsguard, was now asking the heir to the Iron Throne to give it all up. He imagined a life in which he could be more than a servant, and she could be more than a royal heir. In his mind, they would sail to the free cities, perhaps to Pentos or Tyrosh, where they could live simply, away from the politics and the plotting of King's Landing. He saw a future where their love, whatever form it took, could exist without the weight of crowns and duties. But Rhaenyra refused. She was unwilling to trade the Iron Throne for a life of exile and oranges. And that phrase, a life of exile and oranges, captures the essence of her decision. She saw his offer not as a romantic escape, but as a descent into obscurity. She was the Princess of Dragonstone, the named heir of King Viserys I. She had been raised to rule, to command dragons, to sit on the Iron Throne. The idea of abandoning all of that to live in some foreign city, eating oranges and watching ships come and go, was not a dream to her. It was a nightmare. To Criston, however, her refusal was not merely political. It felt like the destruction of his honour. He had offered her everything he had, everything he was. He had risked his position, his life, his very soul by proposing this, and she had rejected him. In his mind, this was not a simple disagreement about the future of the realm. It was a personal betrayal. He had given her his heart, and she had thrown it away. This moment is the fracture point. Before this, Criston was her champion, her protector, her heart brother. After this, something in him breaks. He cannot reconcile the woman he loved with the woman who would choose power over him, and so he begins to turn. He begins to see her not as his princess, but as a threat to everything he holds dear. His honour, once tied to her, now becomes tied to her destruction, and it is in this bitterness that he finds a new purpose. He shifts his allegiance to Queen Alicent Hightower, the king's wife, who has her own reasons to distrust Rhaenyra. Alicent sees in Criston a broken but loyal tool, a man who can be shaped into a weapon against the princess who spurned him. And Criston, in his wounded pride, accepts this role. He becomes her protector, her confidant, her enforcer. The next time him at a tournament, he is no longer wearing Rhaenyra's favour. He wears Alicent's, and in the jousting that follows, he delivers a blow that kills Joffrey Lonemouth, a supporter of Rhaenyra. The act is brutal, and it cements his role as Alicent's man. From that point forward, there is no turning back. The man who once dreamed of fleeing across the narrow sea with the princess is now her most dangerous enemy, and so the fracture deepens. In the years that follow, Criston Cole becomes a fixture at Alicent's side, a silent shadow in green. He watches as Rhaenyra marries Lyonor Velaryon, a political match that secures her claim but brings her no happiness. He watches as she takes Sir Harwin Strong as a lover, and he watches as 3 sons are born with brown hair and brown eyes, children who cannot possibly be Laenor's. The court whispers, and Criston listens. He does not defend her now. He does not make excuses for her. Instead, he stores every rumour, every glance, every whispered doubt, and he turns them over in his mind like stones in a riverbed. Each one becomes a piece of evidence against her, proof that she is not the woman he once believed her to be. When the time comes for Rhaenyra's sons to be questioned about their parentage, Criston is there. He stands before the Iron Throne, his white cloak pristine, his voice steady, and he speaks against her. He calls her children bastards. He calls her a liar. He does this not because he believes it is just, but because it is the only way he can make sense of his own pain. If she is wicked, then his love was not foolish. If she is corrupt, then his hatred is righteous. He must believe in her villainy, because the alternative, that she simply did not want him, is too much to bear. This is the tragedy of Criston Cole. He is not a simple villain. He is a man who loved too deeply and broke too completely. And in his breaking, he becomes a catalyst for war. When King Viserys dies, it is Criston who stands with Alicent, who helps her seize power for her son Aegon. It is Criston who crowns the usurper, who leads the Kingsguard in bending the knee to a false king. And it is Criston who, when the war begins, commands the armies of the Greens. He fights not for glory, not for gold, but for a woman who will never love him back, and against a woman who once did. The war that follows is called the Dance of the Dragons. It is a war of fire and blood, of dragons dying in the sky and cities burning in the night. And at its heart is Criston Cole, the man who could have been a lover but chose to be a killer. He leads his forces into battle after battle, his face a mask of cold determination. But those who look closely see the cracks. They see the way his hands tremble when he holds a letter from King's Landing. They see the way he stares too long at the horizon, as if searching for something he lost long ago. In the end, Criston Cole dies as he lived, in service to a cause that was never truly his. He is killed in the Battle of the King's Road, cut down by men who fight for Rhaenyra. His last moments are not heroic. They are lonely and bitter, a fitting end for a man who spent his final years alone, even when surrounded by armies. And as he falls, perhaps he thinks of that offer he made so long ago, the offer of a simple life in a faraway city, a life of exile and oranges. Perhaps he wonders what might have been if only she had said yes. But the dragons dance on, and the world burns, and Criston Cole becomes nothing more than a footnote in a history written by the victors. Yet his story lingers, a warning about the dangers of love turned to hate, of pride turned to poison, of a heart that could not heal, and a kingdom that could not survive its wounds. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. He offered her a life beyond the crown, beyond the Red Keep, beyond the endless calculations of lords and heirs. A simple life across the narrow sea, where she would be no princess and he would be no sworn shield. But Rhaenyra Targaryen was not born to be simple. She was born to be queen, and so the answer she gave him was not the one he had hoped for. It was not even the one he had feared. It was the only answer that her blood and her duty would allow. She refused him, and in that refusal, something inside Criston Cole began to crack. The princess did not choose the man who loved her. She chose her future, and her future demanded a dynastic marriage. It demanded an alliance that would strengthen her claim to the Iron Throne, that would bind the great houses to her cause, that would give her sons the legitimacy her enemies would always question. So King Viserys and his council looked to the sea. They looked to Driftmark, to the ancient and powerful house Velaryon, and they found a match that made perfect political sense. Lyonor Velaryon was the son of Lord Corlys, the Sea Snake, the wealthiest man in all of Westeros. He was a dragon rider, mounted on the magnificent Sea Smoke, and his marriage to Rhaenyra would unite the two great Targaryen bloodlines, the crown and the fleet, the throne and the treasury. For Rhaenyra, this was not a choice born of passion. It was a choice born of survival. She understood, perhaps better than her father ever did, that a queen could not rule on love alone. She needed swords, she needed ships, she needed gold, and Lyonor Velaryon could give her all three. So she accepted the match. She agreed to marry a man she did not love, a man whose own preferences lay elsewhere, because that was what her duty demanded. That was what it meant to be, the heir to the Iron Throne. But Criston Cole did not see it that way. He did not see the political calculus, the desperate need for allies, the weight of a crown that would never rest easy on a woman's head. He saw only rejection. He saw only the woman he had given everything for, the woman for whom he had broken his sacred vows, the woman who had let him believe he was more than a servant, turning away from him and toward a man who could give her something he never could, a dragon, a fleet, a throne. And so the beloved princess, the girl he had trained, protected and adored, began to transform in his mind. She was no longer the radiant heir who had smiled at him from the dais. She was the woman who had exposed his weakness. She was the woman who had seen the depth of his devotion and then chosen another. She was the woman who had asked him to sacrifice everything, only to sacrifice him in return. In the space of a single refusal, Rhaenyra Targaryen became, in the heart of Criston Cole, the architect of his shame. The wedding was held on the 14th day of the second moon of the year 114 after Aegon's conquest. It was a grand affair, as befitting the union of two such powerful houses. The great hall of the Red Keep was draped in Targaryen red and Velaryon seafoam. Lords and ladies from across the realm gathered to witness the ceremony, and at the centre of it all stood Rhaenyra, radiant in a gown of black and gold, her silver gold hair cascading down her back. Beside her stood Lyonor Velaryon, handsome and composed, his white cloak a stark contrast to his dark skin. But there was another figure at that wedding whose presence spoke louder than any vows. Criston Cole entered the tourney grounds, wearing a favour that was not Rhaenyra's. He wore the favour of Queen Alicent Hightower, the woman who had once been Rhaenyra's dearest friend, and who had become, by the slow poison of courtly politics, her most dangerous rival. It was a public declaration of allegiance. It was a signal to every lord and lady in attendance that Sir Criston Cole had chosen his side, and it was not the side of the princess he had once sworn to protect. The jousting that followed was brutal. Criston rode with a fury that had nothing to do with sport. He unhorsed opponent after opponent, his Morningstar swinging with a violence that made the crowd gasp. And then came the moment that would seal his transformation. During the melee, he struck down Sir Joffrey Lonemouth, a Knight of the Reach who had been a close companion of Lyonor Velaryon and a vocal supporter of Rhaenyra's claim. The blow was not accidental. It was delivered with the full force of Criston's rage. Joffrey Lonemouth died 6 days later, his skull crushed by the impact, and though Criston was never formally charged with murder, no one in the Red Keep doubted what had happened. The Kingsguard Knight had killed a man in cold blood, and he had done it to send a message. From that day forward, Criston Cole was no longer Rhaenyra's protector. He was her enemy. He became the personal sworn shield of Queen Alicent, the leader of the faction that would come to be known as the Greens. He taught her son Aemond to fight with a blade, sharpening the prince into a weapon that would one day be turned against Rhaenyra's own children. He stood in the shadows of the small council, whispering advice that hardened Alicent's heart and deepened the divide between the queen and the heir. And all the while, Rhaenyra moved forward. She married Lyonor Velaryon. She bore sons who carried the Velaryon name, though their silver hair and Targaryen features whispered of a different father. She strengthened her alliances, built her network of supporters, and waited for the day when her father's promise would be fulfilled. Her future remained tied to dragons, to inheritance, to the throne that had been promised to her since she was a girl of 8. She did not have the luxury of looking back at the man she left behind, but Criston Cole could not look away. He saw every choice she made as a personal betrayal. Her marriage to Lyonor was not a political necessity. It was a rejection of his love. Her sons were not the legitimate heirs of House Velaryon. They were proof of her dishonour. Her alliance with Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince who had once been his rival in the tourney lists, was not a strategic move to secure her claim. It was a final, unforgivable insult. In Criston's mind, the woman he had once called his heart-brother had become something monstrous. She was the woman who had exposed his weakness, who had seen the depth of his devotion and then chosen another, who had rejected his sacrifice as if it meant nothing. And so the stage was set. The princess had chosen her future, but in doing so, she had also chosen her most dangerous enemy. The man who had once loved her would spend the rest of his life trying to destroy everything she had built, and he would succeed in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The Dance of the Dragons was still years away, but its first spark had already been struck. It was struck in the heart of a common-born knight who could not accept that he was not the centre of a princess's world. It was struck in the refusal that echoed through the halls of the Red Keep, a refusal that would one day be answered with fire and blood. Rhaenyra made her choice. She chose the throne. She chose her father's legacy. She chose a dynastic marriage to Lyonor Velaryon, and later an alliance with Daemon Targaryen. And in doing so, she left Criston Cole standing alone in the shadow of everything he could never be. What happens next is not a quiet retreat. It is not a dignified acceptance of fate. Criston Cole does not simply walk away from Rhaenyra Targaryen. He does not nurse his wounds in private, nor does he seek solace in the quiet corners of the Kingsguard Tower. Instead, he does something far more dangerous. He responds to rejection not with distance, but with an enduring and public hatred. The man who once wore her favour begins to define himself against her. Every word he speaks, every oath he swears, every blow he strikes in the training yard becomes a declaration of opposition. He no longer fights for her, he fights against her, and the weapon he chooses is not a sword or a Morningstar, though he is deadly with both. The weapon he chooses is his own code of honour. Criston Cole had always been a man of rigid principles. He was born common, but he rose through discipline. He believed in the sanctity of the Kingsguard oath. He believed in chastity, in purity, in the idea that a knight's word was his bond. And now, those ideals become weapons aimed directly at Rhaenyra. He begins to speak of her not as a princess he once served, but as a woman who has broken every sacred rule he holds dear. He whispers that she is unchaste, that she is unworthy, that she has sullied the very concept of honour. It is a remarkable transformation. The same man who once asked for her favour in front of the entire court now cannot speak her name without venom. The same man who taught her sons to fight now looks at them with cold contempt. He does not see children. He sees evidence of her betrayal. He sees proof that she is not the pure, untouchable figure he once imagined her to be. And yet, there is something else beneath the surface, something that the histories do not fully explain, but that they cannot quite ignore. Criston Cole's hatred is not cold. It is hot. It is personal. It is the kind of hatred that only exists where love once lived. He does not simply disagree with Rhaenyra's choices. He is wounded by them, and he cannot let that wound heal. A private humiliation now seeks a political outlet, and Queen Alicent provides one. Alicent Hightower had always been a presence at court, but she had never been the centre of Criston's world. That was Rhaenyra's place. But now, Alicent offers something that Rhaenyra never could. She offers alignment. She offers a shared grievance. She offers a cause. Alicent too had been wronged by Rhaenyra, not in the same way perhaps, but deeply nonetheless. He had watched her childhood friend become the heir to the throne, had watched her father Otto Hightower manoeuvre for influence, had watched her own sons pushed aside in favour of Rhaenyra's bastards, and she had watched Rhaenyra do it all, with a confidence that Alicent could never muster. So when Criston Cole turns to Alicent, he finds a willing partner. She does not reject him. She does not remind him of his oath. She does not tell him to move on. Instead, she gives him purpose. She gives him a new favour to wear. She gives him a new princess to protect. And in return, he gives her everything. He becomes her personal enforcer. He trains her son, Aemond, to be a killer. He stands beside her in every council, every feast, every quiet moment of plotting. He becomes the sword that Alicent never had to wield herself. But this is not just about politics. This is not just about succession. This is about a man who could not have the woman he wanted, and so decided to destroy everything she stood for. At Rhaenyra's wedding to Laenor Velaryon, the tension becomes visible. Criston Cole does not wear Rhaenyra's favour. He wears Alicent's. It is a public statement, a declaration of allegiance, a signal to everyone in the hall that the knight who once loved the princess now serves her enemy. And then comes the joust. And then comes Joffrey Lonemouth. Joffrey Lonemouth was a knight of the Reach, a supporter of Rhaenyra, and a man who had reportedly made a comment about Criston's relationship with the princess. Some accounts say he laughed. Some say he whispered. Some say he simply looked at Criston the wrong way. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. Criston Cole delivers a blow that shatters Joffrey's helm. The knight falls from his horse, bleeding from the head. He dies 6 days later. It is a killing that could be called an accident, if one were generous. But no one at court is generous. Everyone knows what it was. It was a message. It was a warning. It was the first public act of violence in a war that had not yet been declared. And from that moment on, there is no turning back. Criston Cole is no longer just a knight nursing a broken heart. He is a man who has chosen a side. He is a man who has drawn blood. He is a man who will never again be seen as neutral. The ideals he once held sacred now serve as his justification. He tells himself that he is defending the realm. He tells himself that Rhaenyra is a threat to order, to tradition, to the very fabric of the Seven Kingdoms. He tells himself that his hatred is righteous, but the truth is simpler. The truth is that he loved her, and she chose someone else. And that is a wound that honour cannot heal, so he buries it. He buries it beneath layers of duty, beneath oaths of loyalty to Alicent, beneath the cold steel of his armour. He becomes the perfect knight in every way that matters to the court. He is disciplined, he is loyal, he is deadly. But underneath it all, there is a grudge, and that grudge will grow. It will fester, it will spread through the court like a poison, infecting every decision, every alliance, every whispered word. And when the time comes, when King Viserys draws his last breath, and the realm stands on the edge of chaos, that grudge will not stay buried. It will rise, it will speak, and it will crown a king. But before that crown is placed, there is still a decade of simmering hatred. There are still years of quiet plotting, of training Aemond, of standing beside Alicent in the shadows of the Red Keep. There are still moments when Criston Cole looks at Rhaenyra across the hall and remembers what it felt like to wear her favour. And in those moments, he does not look away. He holds her gaze, and he waits. Criston Cole's hatred did not burn in isolation. It needed a home, purpose, a a mirror that would reflect his anger back at him and call it virtue, and he found that mirror in the Queen in Green. Alicent Hightower had once been Rhaenyra's closest companion. They had been girls together, reading histories in the library, whispering secrets in the corridors of the Red Keep. But queenship changes people. It isolates them. It forces them to see threats where they once saw only friendship. And by the time the rift between Rhaenyra and her father began to widen, Alicent had already begun to understand that her own children would never be safe under a reigning Queen Rhaenyra. This fear was not irrational. In the world of Westeros, where dragons decide, succession and bloodlines are contested with fire and steel, the children of a second wife are always vulnerable. If Rhaenyra ascended the Iron Throne, what would become of Aegon, of Aemond, of Helena? Would they be allowed to live quietly as princes and princesses, or would they be seen as threats to be eliminated? Alicent had heard enough stories of Maegor the Cruel, of the dance of the dragons that had not yet begun, to know that mercy was rarely extended to rivals, and so she began to build her own court. Not openly, not with banners and declarations, but with quiet conversations, with favours exchanged, with loyalties cultivated in the shadows. She wore green at the tournament that celebrated the heir's succession, the colour of House Hightower, and those who noticed understood the message. The Queen in Green was gathering her strength. It was into this gathering that Criston Cole stepped, and he stepped willingly. After the rejection, after the wedding, after the killing of Joffrey Lonemouth, Criston needed something to hold on to. He had built his identity around honour, around service, around the idea that he was a man of worth despite his common birth. But Rhaenyra had shattered that identity. She had chosen Daemon, had chosen her throne, had chosen a future that did not include him, and in doing so, she had made him feel small again, reminded him that no matter how skilled he was with the sword, he was still just a knight from the Dornish Marches, a steward's son who had risen too high and could be cast down just as easily. Alicent offered him something else. She offered him a cause. She offered him a patron who saw his anger and called it loyalty, who saw his bitterness and called it righteousness. In her service, Criston could hate Rhaenyra openly, and that hatred would be rewarded. He would not be a scorned lover nursing a private wound. He would be a protector, a defender of the true succession, a knight who stood against the corruption of the court, and so he became her most devoted protector. He taught her son Aemond to fight, shaping the boy into a warrior who would one day claim the largest dragon in the world. He stood beside her at council meetings, his white cloak a symbol of his allegiance. He wore her favour at tournaments, not Rhaenyra's, and let the court see where his loyalties lay. For Criston, this new allegiance offered something he had been desperately seeking. Permission to hate without guilt, permission to act on his resentment without calling it revenge. He could tell himself that he was serving the realm, that he was upholding the laws of succession, that he was protecting the true-born heirs of King Viserys. But underneath all of that, he was simply giving himself over to the darkness that had taken root in his heart. The friendship between Alicent and Rhaenyra had long since curdled into rivalry, and Criston Cole became the blade that rivalry wielded. He was the enforcer, the voice of accusation, the man who would say the things that Alicent could not say herself. He would call Rhaenyra's children bastards. He would question her virtue. He would remind the court, again and again, that the princess was not fit to rule. And the more he did this, the more he convinced himself that he was right. The more he served Alicent, the more he believed that his original devotion to Rhaenyra had been a mistake, a youthful folly, a sin he had to atone for. And atonement for a man like Criston Cole meant destruction. So the Queen in Green gathered her allies, and the knight in white armour stood at her side, and the seeds of the dance of the dragons were watered with old wounds and new hatreds. The fire was not yet lit, but the kindling was dry and the wind was beginning to blow. The quiet rivalry between the Queen and the princess had, for years, been a thing of whispers and stolen glances. But after the events of the Hearst tournament, that rivalry found its colours. It became something the entire court could see, something that could no longer be denied or smoothed over with pleasantries. The royal household began to divide, slowly at first, then with an inevitability that felt like the turning of the seasons. It was not a single decree or a dramatic confrontation that split the Red Keep. It was 1,000 small choices. Which side of the hall you sat on during a feast, whose children you allowed to play with yours, whose health you toasted at a wedding. Every celebration, every marriage pact, every birth of a child became another contest over legitimacy and succession. The court was no longer a single body serving one king. It was two camps, each watching the other, each waiting for the moment when the old king would finally pass. And in the centre of this growing divide stood Sir Criston Cole. His white cloak remained as spotless as the day he had first put it on. He polished his armour, kept his vows of chastity, and stood his watch with the same stoic discipline that had earned him his place in the King's Guard. But his loyalties had become intensely partisan. He no longer pretended to be neutral. He stood visibly with the Queen, Alicent Hightower, at every public function. When the king held court, Criston's eyes were on the Greens, not the Blacks. When there was a dispute between the Queen's faction and the Princess's faction, Criston's hand was never far from his sword, and that hand was always ready to serve Alicent. It was a strange thing to witness. The King's Guard were sworn to protect the entire royal family, to be above the petty squabbles of court politics. Their white cloaks were supposed to signify an impartial purity, a dedication to the crown itself, not to any one claimant. But Criston had made his choice. He had chosen his queen over his princess, and he had chosen his hatred over his honour. The white cloak remained spotless in appearance, but the man beneath it had become something else entirely. He was a partisan warrior, dressed in the uniform of a neutral guardian. The shift was most visible during the great feasts. When the king presided over a meal in the Great Hall, the seating arrangements told the story. Rhaenyra and her supporters, including her husband Lyonor Velaryon and her uncle Daemon when he was in the capital, would gather on one side. They wore the colours of House Targaryen, black and red, and they flew the three-headed dragon. On the other side sat Alicent and her children, Aegon, Helena and Aemond. They dressed in green, the colour of House Hightower, and their banners bore the green dragon of the Queen's personal standard. Between them, the king sat at the head of the table, his body failing, his mind clouded by illness and milk of the poppy. He saw the division perhaps, but he could no longer command it to stop. He had named Rhaenyra his heir, but he had also given Alicent the power to challenge that choice. He had tried to have both, and in doing so, he had given the court a war that would not wait for his death to begin. Every marriage became a political statement. When a lord from the Reach married a lady from the Riverlands, the question was not whether the match was good for the houses, but whether the bride and groom wore green or black at the ceremony. Every birth of a child was scrutinised. Was the baby named after a Targaryen king or a Hightower ancestor? Did the mother choose Rhaenyra as a godmother or Alicent? These were the questions that mattered. Now, the questions that determined who would live and who would die. When the old king finally closed his eyes. Criston Cole was not just a participant in this game, he was one of its most active players. He trained Aemond in the yard, teaching the young prince to be deadly with a sword, to be ruthless, to never show weakness. He stood guard outside Alicent's chambers, a silent sentinel who reminded everyone who passed that the queen had a protector who would kill for her. And when there was a tourney or a joust, Criston wore the queen's favour, not the princess's. He made sure everyone saw it. The memory of Joffrey Lonemouth hung over every public appearance. Criston had killed a man at a wedding, a man who had merely laughed at him, and he had done it in front of the entire court. The king had not punished him, the queen had defended him, and Rhaenyra had been forced to watch as the man who had once been her champion became her enemy's sword. That act had set a precedent. Violence was now a tool of politics. The court was divided into colours, and those colours would soon be stained with blood. It is easy to look back and see the tragedy of it all. The king had wanted peace. He had wanted his daughter to rule after him, and he had wanted his wife to be respected. But he had not understood that you cannot have two queens in one kingdom. You cannot have two claimants to the throne without a war. The division of the court was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a failure of imagination. Viserys could not imagine that his daughter would be challenged. Alicent could not imagine that her sons would be passed over. And Criston Cole could not imagine a world in which he was not the most important man in the room. So the court continued to divide. The blacks and the greens grew more entrenched. The feasts grew more tense. The marriages grew more strategic. And the births grew more fraught with meaning. Every event was a battle, and every battle was a step closer to the war that would consume them all. The White Cloak of the Kingsguard was supposed to be a symbol of unity, but in the hands of Criston Cole, it became a flag of rebellion. He stood with the Queen, his sword ready, his heart full of bitterness, and he waited. He waited for the king to die. He waited for the moment when he could finally strike at the woman who had rejected him. He waited for the war that would make him a kingmaker, and when that moment came, he would not hesitate. He would not question. He would simply act, and the realm would burn for it. The royal household, once a single tapestry woven with the threads of a single family, had begun to fray. The colours were no longer just the crimson and black of House Targaryen. They were becoming distinct, two separate banners. Rhaenyra's supporters gathered in shades of black, the colour of her dragons and her claim. Alicent's court, more quietly, dressed in the green of the Hightower, a signal of a different future, a different king. Every feast, every marriage, every birth was no longer a celebration of unity, but a move on a board where the stakes were the Iron Throne itself. And so, when the announcement came that Princess Rhaenyra would wed Sir Lyonor Velaryon, it was not a moment of simple joy. It was a political treaty, an alliance meant to shore up her claim with the wealth and power of Driftmark. The ceremony was to be a grand affair, a display of strength meant to silence the whispers of division. But for Sir Criston Cole, it was a public stage for a private agony. He had offered Rhaenyra everything, a life beyond the cage of the Red Keep, a simple existence across the narrow sea. She had chosen duty, chosen dragons, chosen a future that did not include him. The rejection had not faded into a quiet, sorrowful memory. It had calcified into a hard, bitter stone in his chest. And on the day of her wedding, he would not hide his allegiance. He would not pretend. As the guests assembled in the great sept of Baelor, a sea of silks and velvets, one detail was impossible to miss. Sir Criston Cole, the knight who had once worn Rhaenyra's favour so proudly, now wore the favour of Queen Alicent. A piece of green fabric tied to his arm was a declaration. It was a public choice, a signal to the entire court that his loyalty had shifted. It was a silent but unmistakable insult to the princess he had once sworn to protect. The whispers began immediately, a low hum of speculation that followed him through the crowds. Among the wedding guests was a man named Joffrey Lonemouth. He was a knight, a companion and close ally of the groom, Lyonor Velaryon. Joffrey was not a man of the court, but he was observant. He knew the ways of men, the secrets that could hide behind a knight's white cloak. He watched Criston Cole, saw the rigid set of his jaw, the way his eyes followed Rhaenyra not with love, but with a cold, hard fury, and Joffrey understood. He saw the dangerous truth that connected the knight and the princess, the secret that had been buried in the gardens of the Red Keep. He knew that Criston's hatred was born from a broken intimacy, a promise that had been shattered. During the wedding feast, the air was thick with forced merriment. Wine flowed freely, and the music tried to drown out the tension. Joffrey, perhaps emboldened by drink, or perhaps simply believing he was offering a gesture of peace, approached Sir Criston. He spoke quietly, a few words meant to acknowledge the unspoken understanding between them. He did not threaten. He did not accuse. He simply let Criston know that he knew, and that was enough. What happened next was not a duel. It was not a knightly contest. It was an explosion. Criston Cole, the man of discipline and honour, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, attacked Joffrey Lonemouth with a savagery that shocked the hall. It was not a sword fight. It was a beating. He used his fists, his feet, anything he could find. He smashed a goblet and used the jagged edge. The music stopped. The laughter died. The guests watched in frozen horror as the White Knight became a butcher. He did not stop until the guards pulled him away, leaving Joffrey broken and bleeding on the marble floor. Joffrey Lonemouth did not die that night. He lingered for 6 days, his body failing, his mind slipping away. The maesters did what they could, but the damage was too deep, and when he finally passed, the wedding feast was no longer a memory of union, but a scar. It was another wound in the royal family, a fresh gash that bled openly. The colours of the court were no longer just a quiet division. They were now stained with blood. The secret that Joffrey had recognised was now a weapon, and Criston Cole had proven he was willing to use it. The question that hung in the air, unanswered, was what he would do next, now that his violence had been unleashed. The blood had barely dried on the tourney field before the whispers began. Joffrey Lonemouth, Rhaenyra Velaryon's companion and a knight of respectable skill, lay dying from a blow delivered by Criston Cole's Morningstar. The official account, repeated by Cole's defenders and the Queen's faction, was simple. Enough. Joffrey had insulted the knight's honour, perhaps threatened him, certainly provoked him. In the heat of a joust, such things happen. A knight's temper, a sharp word, a fatal swing. Tragedy, but not murder. But there was another story, one that spread through the corridors of the Red Keep, like smoke under a door. Joffrey Lonemouth had known something. He had been close to Rhaenyra Velaryon, close enough to understand the arrangement between the princess and her new husband. He had seen the way Criston looked at Rhaenyra, the way Rhaenyra looked away. He had recognised the dangerous secret that connected them, the secret that could destroy a princess, a knight, and a kingdom. And so, when Criston Cole rode against him in the lists, some said it was not a response to insult or threat. It was a silencing. Criston's enemies saw it clearly. A knight who murders to silence anyone who knows too much. The contradiction becomes central to his character from this moment forward. He worships honour while violating its spirit. He took a sacred vow to protect the innocent, to defend the weak, to serve the realm with unwavering integrity. And yet, here he was, standing over a dying man whose only crime was knowing the truth about the knight's own broken oath. The mask of honour had slipped, just for a moment, and underneath was the face of a man who would kill to protect his reputation. The irony is almost too sharp to hold. Criston Cole had built his entire identity on the idea of chivalric virtue. He was the common-born boy who rose through skill and discipline, the knight who defeated Daemon Targaryen in the melee, the Lord Commander who guarded the king with his life. He was supposed to be the example, the proof that honour could lift a man from the dust of the Dornish Marches to the highest tower of the Red Keep. But honour, as he understood it, was a fragile thing. It required witnesses who believed in it, and Joffrey Lonemouth had seen behind the curtain. From this point onward, fear becomes as useful to him as skill with a blade. He had always been a deadly fighter, but now he wielded something more potent, the terror of a man who has nothing left to lose. If anyone questioned his motives, if anyone whispered about the wedding, if anyone looked too closely at the relationship between the princess and her former champion, they would remember what happened to Joffrey Lonemouth. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. Criston Cole would protect his honour, even if he had to break every rule of honour to do it. And so the court learned to tread carefully around him. The knights of the Kingsguard, who had once respected him as a brother, now watched him with wary eyes. The servants, who had once admired his rise from common birth, now crossed the courtyard to avoid his path. Even Queen Alicent, who had given him her favour and her trust, must have wondered what she had truly set in motion. She had wanted a champion, a protector for her children, a sword that would never bend to Rhaenyra. What she got was a man whose loyalty was purchased with the blood of a dead knight, a man who would stop at nothing to keep his secrets buried. But the secrets were not buried. They festered, they grew, and they would eventually tear the realm apart. The wedding feast continued, as feasts must, but the joy had drained from the hall. Rhaenyra sat beside her new husband, Laenor Velaryon, their hands barely touching, their eyes fixed on separate horizons. She knew what Criston had done. She knew why. And she knew that the man who had once been her heart brother, the man who had taught her sons to fight, the man who had sworn to protect her with his life, was now her enemy, not because she had rejected him, though that was the wound that festered, but because she had seen him clearly. She had seen the mask, and she had seen the face beneath. Criston Cole left the wedding early, his white cloak stained with dust and blood. He did not look back at the princess. He did not seek her forgiveness, nor did he offer any explanation. He simply walked away, into the shadow of the Red Keep, where the walls were thick enough to swallow any sound. And in that silence he began to rebuild himself, not as the Knight of Honor, the champion of the princess, the beloved protector, but as something harder, colder, more dangerous. He became the Kingmaker, the man who would decide the fate of a dynasty. But first he had to decide whose side he truly belonged to. The answer, when it came, was not a surprise to anyone who had watched the wedding. He belonged to Alicent Hightower. He belonged to the Greens. He belonged to the faction that would stop at nothing to see Rhaenyra's claim destroyed. And he belonged to himself, to his own ambition, to his own wounded pride, to his own relentless need to be seen as honourable, even as he committed the most dishonourable acts. The court divided further after that night. The Blacks and the Greens had already been forming, like clouds before a storm. But the death of Joffrey Lonemouth was the first lightning strike. It showed that the conflict was no longer about words, about favours, about whispered conversations in candlelit chambers. It was about blood, and Criston Cole had drawn the first drop. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. Some said that Joffrey had not been the only one who knew the truth. Some said that Laenor Velaryon himself had suspected, that he had confronted Criston privately, that the night's fury was not just about the wedding, but about the exposure of something far older and far more shameful. But those whispers never reached the throne room. They never reached the king. Viserys, already failing, already retreating into his models of old Valyria, heard only what his queen allowed him to hear. And Queen Alicent, for her part, had no interest in investigating the death of a knight who had been loyal to her rival. So the truth was buried, as truths often are, beneath layers of convenience and fear. Joffrey Lonemouth was given a quiet funeral, his name spoken in hushed tones, his death attributed to the hazards of the tourney. And Criston Cole continued to serve, continued to train the young princes, continued to stand guard at the king's door, his white cloak immaculate, his face unreadable. But something had changed in him. The mask of honor had cracked, and though he tried to repair it, the cracks were visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He was no longer the idealistic knight who had won the melee at Maidenpool. He was a man who had killed to protect a secret, and he would kill again if he had to. The question was not whether he would cross that line again, but when. And the answer, as the years passed and the king's health declined, was that he would cross it many times. He would cross it when he convinced Aegon to claim the throne. He would cross it when he led armies against Rhaenyra's supporters. He would cross it when he ordered the deaths of those who stood in his way. Each time, he would tell himself that he was acting in the name of honor, in the name of duty, in the name of the realm. But the realm would remember him differently. It would remember him as the man who started a war over a broken heart, who masked his vengeance with virtue, who wore the white cloak of the Kingsguard while staining it with the blood of his enemies. The night of the wedding faded, but its shadow stretched across the years. And in that shadow, Criston Cole found his purpose. He would not be the knight who loved the princess. He would be the knight who destroyed her. and he would do it all in the name of honor. The next morning, the sun rose over King's Landing, as it always did. Indifferent to the blood that had been spilled, indifferent to the secrets that had been buried, the city stirred, the markets opened, the dragons flew overhead, and in the training yard of the Red Keep, Criston Cole took up his Morningstar and began to swing. The rhythm was steady, relentless, practiced. Each strike was a prayer, each blow a confession. He was not training for the next tourney. He was training for the war that was coming, the war he would help ignite, the war that would consume everything he had once loved. And as he swung, he whispered a name under his breath, a name that had once been a promise and was now a curse: Rhaenyra. There is a difference between teaching a man to fight and teaching a boy to hate. In the training yards of the Red Keep, Sir Criston Cole had always been a master of the first. But after the blood of Joffrey Lonemouth had been scrubbed from the stones, after the whispers had died down, and the court had settled into its uneasy rhythm, Criston turned his attention to a far more dangerous lesson. He began to shape the next generation of the royal conflict through martial instruction, and in doing so, he planted seeds that would grow into a war. The sons of Queen Alicent were young, but they were not innocent. Prince Aegon, the eldest, was already showing the signs of a boy who would rather drown his responsibilities in wine than face them. Prince Aemond, the second son, was different. He was sharp, watchful, and burning with a quiet resentment that Criston recognized immediately. It was the same fire that had once burned in his own chest, when he had been denied what he believed was his due. And so, when Criston took up the training sword to instruct the Queen's children, he found his most eager student not in the heir to the throne, but in the boy who had something to prove. The lessons began, as they always did, with the basics of footwork and the weight of a blade. But Criston was not merely teaching swordsmanship, he was teaching a philosophy. Every lunge, every parry, every counter-strike carried with it the unspoken truth that the world was a place of enemies and allies, and that the only honor that mattered was the kind you could defend with steel. For Aemond, whose older brother was the king-in-waiting, and whose sister Helaena was already betrothed, there was a constant sense of being second. He was not the favourite. He did not have a dragon, and in a family where dragons were the measure of a person's worth, that absence was a wound that festered. Criston did not try to heal that wound. He trained Alicent's sons, but he poured the most of himself into Aemond. The boy's resentment, his discipline, his ferocity, these were not flaws to be corrected, they were tools to be honed. Criston would stand across from the prince in the yard, Morningstar in hand, and he would push. He would press the attack until Aemond's arms burned and his breath came in ragged gasps. And when the boy faltered, Criston did not offer comfort, he offered a harder truth. He would say that the world would not wait for him to catch his breath, that the enemies of his mother and his house would not show mercy, that the only way to survive was to become the thing they feared. And Aemond listened. He absorbed every word like a dry sponge takes water. The knight was no longer guarding the realm's peace. He was preparing boys for a war not yet declared. In the quiet of the training yard, with the sun beating down on the white stone and the clang of steel echoing off the walls, Criston Cole was building an army of two, but it was the younger prince who would carry the weight of those lessons into the darkest corners of the coming conflict. There is a particular cruelty in teaching a child to hate before they have learned to understand. Criston did not speak of politics or succession. He did not explain the nuances of the Great Council or the legal arguments for and against Rhaenyra's claim. He spoke in absolutes. He spoke of oaths broken and trust betrayed. He spoke of a woman who had once been the realm's delight and had become its greatest threat. And in every story, every lesson, every hard-won victory in the yard, he planted the seed that Prince Aemon would one day water with blood. The training yard became a sanctuary for the prince. It was the one place where his anger was not a flaw but a fuel. It was the one place where his mother's fears and his father's neglect could be turned into something sharp and deadly, and Criston was there, patient and relentless, shaping that anger into a weapon that would one day be unleashed upon the world. But the lessons did not stop at the edge of the yard. They followed the boys into the halls of the Red Keep. Criston would walk with Aemond, pointing out the faces of lords and ladies who sworn fealty to Rhaenyra, whispering their names like a litany of future targets. He would remind the prince that loyalty was a currency that could be bought, sold, and stolen. He would tell him that the only person he could truly trust was himself, and perhaps the man who held the sword at his side. And so the knight, who had once been the princess's champion, became the queen's weapon, and the boy, who had once been overlooked, became the blade that would cut the realm in two. The training was not just about swords, it was about vengeance. It was about preparing for a war that had not yet been declared, but that everyone could feel gathering on the horizon like a storm. The other children of the court noticed the change. Rhaenyra's sons, the boys she had with Harwin Strong, were trained in the same yards by different masters, but they were not taught to hate. They were taught to defend. And that difference, subtle as it seemed, would one day determine the shape of the battlefield. As the years passed, the training yard became a stage for a drama that no one in the court could ignore. The Greens and the Blacks were not just divided by politics, they were divided by the very way they learned to fight. And at the centre of it all, Criston Cole stood as the master of ceremonies, his white cloak billowing in the wind, his eyes fixed on a future that only he could see. The war was coming, and he was making sure that the Queen's sons would be ready to meet it. The previous chapter closed with Criston Cole shaping the next generation through martial instruction, training Queen Alicent's sons in the hard lessons of swordsmanship and vengeance. But while Criston was moulding Prince Aemond into a blade of the Greens, another generation was being born into the heart of the succession crisis itself. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne, gave birth to 3 sons in rapid succession: Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey Velaryon. These were not just children, they were living claims. Every birth was a political event, a statement that the line of succession would continue through Rhaenyra's body. But the whispers began almost immediately, and they were not kind. The boys had brown hair, they had brown eyes. Their features were unmistakably Targaryen in their colouring, but Lyonor Velaryon, Rhaenyra's husband, was silver-haired and pale-eyed. The Velaryons were a house of the sea, with the blood of old Valyria running as silver as the Targaryens themselves. Yet these children looked nothing like their father. They looked like Harwin Strong, the commander of the City Watch, a man who had become Rhaenyra's constant companion and protector. The court did not need proof, they had eyes. And in a world where blood determined everything, appearance was evidence enough. The births of Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey Velaryon intensified the succession crisis because they introduced a question that could not be answered with silence. Were these boys true-born heirs to the throne, or were they bastards? If they were bastards, then Rhaenyra's claim to the succession was built on a lie. The realm had accepted her as heir because she was the eldest child of King Viserys. But if her own children were not of Velaryon blood, then the entire line of succession was tainted. Their appearance fueled court whispers that they were not Lyonor's true-born heirs, and those whispers did not stay whispers for long. They became the language of the Green faction, a weapon sharpened in the shadows and wielded in the light. Criston Cole embraced the language of bastardy because it served both his personal hatred and the Green cause. This was not a man who stumbled into enmity. He chose it. He cultivated it. Every time he referred to Rhaenyra's sons as the strong boys, he was not just making a crude observation. He was making a political argument. He was saying that the throne of the 7 kingdoms would one day pass to a bastard born of adultery, and that this was an abomination before gods and men. What began as wounded love now became a doctrine about blood, legitimacy, and male rule. Criston's rejection by Rhaenyra had curdled into something far more dangerous. He no longer saw her as a woman who had spurned him. He saw her as a threat to the entire order of the realm. In his mind, a woman who would lie about the parentage of her children was a woman who would lie about anything. A woman who would break the sacred bonds of marriage was a woman who would break the realm. And so Criston became the voice of orthodoxy. He spoke of honor and duty, of the sanctity of the royal bloodline, of the ancient laws that bound the Targaryen dynasty to the Seven Kingdoms. But beneath that rhetoric was something far more personal. He was still the man who had knelt before Rhaenyra and offered her his heart, only to be cast aside. He was still the man who had watched her marry another, bear children to another, and build a life that had no room for him. Now he would tear that life apart. The court divided along lines that were not just political, but personal. Those who supported Rhaenyra's sons as true heirs stood with the Blacks. Those who whispered of bastardy and questioned the succession stood with the Greens. And at the centre of that division was Criston Cole, a knight of the Kingsguard, who had once been Rhaenyra's sworn protector and was now her most dangerous enemy. He trained Prince Aemond not just in swordsmanship, but in the language of legitimacy. He taught the boy that blood was everything, that the throne belonged to those who were born to it, and that the sons of Rhaenyra were not true Targaryens. He planted seeds of resentment that would grow into something far darker than simple rivalry. The births of Viserys, Lucerys, and Joffrey Velaryon should have been a time of celebration. They were the future of House Targaryen, the next generation of dragon riders, the heirs to the greatest dynasty in the known world. But instead, they became a question mark, a stain, a weapon, and Criston Cole was the one who sharpened that weapon, who polished it, who taught others how to wield it. He did not start the whispers, but he gave them a voice. He gave them authority. He gave them the weight of the Kingsguard's White Cloak and the power of the Crown's favour. What began as a broken heart became a broken realm, and it all started with 3 boys who had brown hair and brown eyes, who looked like their mother's protector instead of their father's son. The births of Rhaenyra's sons did not quiet the court. They inflamed it. Each child with brown hair and a Velaryon name became a walking accusation, a living argument against the princess's claim. And at the centre of that storm, trying to hold the pieces together with nothing but will and a failing body, sat King Viserys I. He was not blind to the whispers. He could not be. They echoed through every corridor of the Red Keep, through every feast and council meeting. But Viserys had made his choice years ago, and he would not unmake it, not for convenience, not for peace, not even for the wife he loved. So in his final years, the king devoted himself to a task that was probably impossible from the start. He tried to preserve peace between his daughter and his wife, between Rhaenyra and Alicent, between the Blacks and the Greens. He held family dinners where the tension was thick enough to choke on. He presided over ceremonies where smiles were painted on and daggers were hidden in sleeves. He acted as though the unity of the house was still intact, as though the realm was not already splitting down the middle, and he repeated himself over and over at every opportunity, in front of every audience that mattered. Viserys confirmed Rhaenyra as his named heir. He did this despite the growing strength of Alicent's faction. He did this knowing that Otto Hightower was whispering in the Queen's ear, that the lords of the realm were being courted and promised and pressured. He did this while his own body decayed, while the flesh of his face grew thin over the bone, while he lost fingers and teeth and the strength to walk without support. For Criston Cole, these years were a study in patience. He was forced to wait. He stood in the shadows of the throne room and watched the king protect the woman he despised. He watched Viserys place his hand on Rhaenyra's shoulder, call her his heir, speak of her future reign as though it were already written. And Criston could do nothing, not yet. The king was still alive. The oaths still held. The sword of the Kingsguard was bound to the will of the monarch, and that will was fixed on Rhaenyra. But beneath the ceremonies and family dinners, the kingdom was already choosing sides. It was not a sudden thing. It was slow, patient, deliberate. Lords sent letters. Favours were exchanged. Marriages were arranged. The small council meetings grew longer, the arguments sharper. Alicent began to hold her own audiences in the Queen's chambers, and those who came to her left with a clear understanding of where her loyalty lay and what she expected in return. Criston watched all of this with the cold clarity of a man who had already made his choice. He had chosen Alicent, he had chosen her sons, and he had chosen to wait until the moment when waiting would no longer be necessary. The king's health was a clock that everyone could hear ticking. Each year he was a little thinner, each season a little slower, each feast he needed more help to rise from his chair. And yet, even as his body failed, his will did not bend. He would not disinherit Rhaenyra. He would not name Aegon. He would not give the Greens what they wanted while he still drew breath. So the court waited with him. The Blacks waited for him to die so that Rhaenyra could take the throne. The Greens waited for him to die so that they could take it from her. And Criston Cole waited for the day when his sword would no longer be bound to a king who protected his enemy. The family dinners continued. The smiles were painted on. The kingdom held its breath. And Viserys, alone in his chambers at night, must have known that his peace was an illusion, that his efforts to hold the family together were like trying to hold water in his hands. But he kept trying, because that was what a king did. That was what a father did. And he was both until the very end. The end came not with a battle cry, but with a whisper. Viserys I died in his bed, surrounded by family that had long since stopped being a family. His final words were lost to history, swallowed by the grief of a daughter who was not there, and the relief of a wife who was. When the news spread through the Red Keep, it moved like fire through dry grass. The lords and ladies who had been waiting for years suddenly had no more time to wait. The small council convened within hours, and the question that had been avoided for a decade was finally spoken aloud. Who would sit the Iron Throne? The king's named heir, Rhaenyra Targaryen, was at Dragonstone. She had been sent there by her father in what he believed was a gesture of peace, a way to separate the warring factions of his own blood. But in doing so, he had placed her far from the capital when the moment of decision arrived. And in King's Landing, the Greens moved with precision. Alicent Hightower did not weep for long. She had been preparing for this day since the moment she first realised her husband would not change his mind. She had her father Otto recalled to court, and he arrived with the cold efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this summons for years. The small council chambers filled with green cloaks and whispered agreements, and Criston Cole stood at the door, his white cloak pristine, his sword ready, his loyalty fixed. When the decision was made to crown Aegon II, Criston was the one who led the procession through the streets. He walked before the new king, his hand on his sword hilt, his eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of dissent. The people of King's Landing watched in silence. Some cheered, because they always cheered for a coronation. Others held their tongues, because they remembered the princess who had flown on Syrax, who had been promised to them as their queen. But the cheers were loud enough, and the silence was ignored. Criston Cole knelt before Aegon in the dragon pit, and he swore his oath anew. This time the words did not taste like ash. This time he meant every syllable. He would protect this king. He would defend this king, and he would destroy anyone who tried to take the crown from him. Across the narrow sea, on the island of Dragonstone, Rhaenyra received the news not with tears, but with fury. She had been betrayed, not by her father, who had loved her to the end, but by the court she had left behind, by the queen she had once called friend, by the Kingsguard, who had once sworn to protect her. She had her own council, her own lords, her own dragons, and she had her own claim. The war that Viserys had spent his final years trying to prevent was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. The realm split in two, and the dance of the dragons began. Criston Cole did not hesitate. He took the field, leading armies, commanding sieges, fighting with the skill of a man who had spent his entire life training for this moment. He was no longer a boy from the Reach, no longer a knight trying to prove himself. He was the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the Sword of the Greens, the enemy of everything Rhaenyra represented, and he would not stop until her claim was ash and her blood was in the ground. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. King Viserys I died in the 129th year after Aegon's conquest, alone in his bed while the Red Keep slept around him. For years, he had carried the weight of a divided family on a body that was slowly rotting away. Half his face had been lost to the wasting disease, and his remaining eye had long since clouded over. He could no longer walk without assistance, and the Iron Throne itself had become an agony to sit upon. Yet he had continued to hold court, to reaffirm Rhaenyra as his chosen heir, pretend that his word alone could hold the realm together. But the realm was not held together by his word. It was held together by the simple fact that he was still alive, and then he was not. The king died in the early hours of the morning, attended only by his maesters and his silent servants. Queen Alicent was not at his bedside. Neither was Princess Rhaenyra, who had remained on Dragonstone for months, wary of the vipers in her father's court. The king's final moments were quiet, unremarkable, the last breath of a man who had spent his reign trying to please everyone and had ended up pleasing no one. He left behind no peaceful settlement. He left behind no united court. He left behind a daughter who believed she was the rightful queen, a wife who believed her son was the rightful king, and a kingdom that would tear itself apart over the difference. The news of the king's death did not spread through the city like a fire. It was smothered, contained, held in the hands of a very few people who understood exactly what the king's silence had cost them. Queen Alicent was the first to know. She had been waiting for this moment for years, preparing for it in the quiet hours. When her husband's illness had given her time to think, she did not weep. She did not call for the bells to be rung or for the lords to be summoned. Instead, she sent for her father, Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, and she sent for Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. These three people, along with a handful of trusted allies, made a decision in that room that would shape the future of Westeros. They decided to hide the king's death. They decided to seize control of King's Landing before anyone else could act, and they decided that the succession would not follow the king's final wishes. The small council gathered in secrecy, not in the great hall where the lords of the realm would expect to meet, but in a smaller chamber where the candles burned low and the voices stayed soft. They gathered to decide whether to honour Viserys' chosen heir or to set her aside in favour of his eldest son. There was no debate about what the king had wanted. Everyone in that room knew that Viserys had named Rhaenyra his heir, had made the lords of the realm swear oaths to her, had reaffirmed that choice again and again, even as his health failed. But the question before the small council was not about what the king had wanted. It was about what they could get away with. And the answer, as Otto Hightower laid it out, was simple. Rhaenyra was on Dragonstone, isolated from the capital. Aegon was in the Red Keep, surrounded by his mother and his protectors. The treasury, the city watch, and the dragons of the royal family were all within reach. If they moved quickly, they could crown Aegon before Rhaenyra even knew her father was dead. Criston Cole sat at that table and listened. He had spent years serving the king, years watching the court turn against itself, years nursing a resentment that had grown cold and hard inside him. He had once loved Rhaenyra, or thought he had. He had once believed in her, in the future she represented, in the bond they had shared. But that was before she had rejected him. That was before she had chosen Daemon, before she had borne children who were not her sons, before she had shown him that her promises meant nothing. He had watched her become everything he despised, and he had watched the king enable her, protect her, insist that she was worthy of the throne. Now the king was dead, and Criston Cole's long resentment was about to become state policy. He did not argue for mercy. He did not suggest that they wait, that they negotiate, that they give Rhaenyra a chance to bend the knee. He argued for action. He argued for speed. He argued that Aegon must be crowned immediately, before the Blacks could rally, before the realm could choose sides. And when the question of legitimacy arose, when someone pointed out that Rhaenyra's sons were rumoured to be bastards, Criston did not hesitate. He had trained those boys. He had watched them grow. He knew exactly what they were, and he knew exactly what that meant for the succession. Aegon was the king's true-born son. Rhaenyra's children were not. The law was clear, if you chose to read it that way. The small council agreed. The king's death would remain hidden until they were ready. The city gates would be sealed, the dragon keepers would be secured, and Prince Aegon, the reluctant heir who had never wanted the throne, would be found and convinced to accept his crown. Criston Cole was given that task. He was the one who would find Aegon, who would explain to him that his life was in danger, that Rhaenyra would kill him and his children if she took the throne, that he had no choice but to rule. It was a lie in part. Rhaenyra had never threatened Aegon's life, but it was a useful lie, a necessary lie, the kind of lie that starts wars. And so the last night of King Viserys became the first night of the Dance of the Dragons. The king's body lay in his chambers, unattended, unannounced, while the Greens moved through the city like shadows. Alicent Hightower sat in her rooms and prayed. Otto Hightower wrote letters and gave orders. And Criston Cole, the kingmaker, the breaker of oaths, the knight who had once been Rhaenyra's champion, walked through the corridors of the Red Keep with a purpose he had not felt in years. He was no longer serving a king who had failed to hold his family together. He was serving a queen who understood that power must be taken, not given, and he was serving himself. The transition from this night to the war that followed was not a slow drift. It was a sudden, violent shift, the kind of change that happens when a door closes and cannot be opened again. The Greens had made their choice, the Blacks would make theirs, and the realm, which had been balanced on a knife's edge for years, finally fell. King Viserys I was dead. His body, still warm, lay in the bed where he had spent his final years as a living skeleton, and already the whispers had begun. The Queen, Alicent Hightower, had moved with a speed that suggested she had been preparing for this moment for years. She did not weep for long. She did not summon the lords of the realm to hear the king's final words. Instead, she summoned the small council to a chamber in Maegor's holdfast, a room with no windows, where the only light came from candles that flickered like nervous hearts. The Green Council was called in secret in the dead of night, while the city slept and the Red Keep held its breath. And at the centre of that council, standing behind the Queen's chair like a shadow made of steel, stood Sir Criston Cole. Now you must understand what this moment meant. For years, the court had been divided into two factions: the Blacks, who supported Rhaenyra as Viserys' named heir, and the Greens, who rallied around Queen Alicent and her son, Prince Aegon. But division is not the same as action. For all their plotting, for all their whispered conspiracies in corridors and gardens, the Greens had never openly defied the king's will while he lived. Viserys had been the glue holding the realm together, and with his death, that glue dissolved into nothing. The council chamber was filled with familiar faces. Lord Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, sat at the head of the table, his face carved from stone, betraying nothing. Grand Maester Orwyle stood nearby, ready to record whatever was decided. Lord Larys Strong, a clubfoot, lurked in the shadows, his eyes missing nothing, and Sir Criston Cole stood guard, his white cloak immaculate, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. The question before them was simple, and yet it was the most dangerous question anyone could ask in the Seven Kingdoms. Who would sit the Iron Throne? Some councillors argued that Rhaenyra must be crowned, as Viserys had commanded. They pointed to the king's repeated declarations. The oaths sworn by the lords of the realm, the stability that came from honouring a dying man's final wish. It was the lawful path, they said, the path of honour. To break the king's command was to invite chaos, to set a precedent that no succession would ever be secure again. But others insisted that Aegon, as the king's eldest surviving son, should take the throne. They spoke of tradition, of the ancient laws of the Seven Kingdoms that favoured a son over a daughter. They spoke of the whispers that had followed Rhaenyra's children, the rumours of bastardy that had never been proven but never quite silenced. They spoke of the danger of placing a woman on the throne when a man was available, of the wars that had been fought over weaker claims. And this is where Criston Cole made his move. He did not argue, he did not debate. He simply stood there, a presence that reminded every man in that room what happened to those who crossed the Queen's protector. He helped ensure that hesitation was treated as danger and loyalty to Rhaenyra as treason. Every time a councillor hesitated, every time someone suggested that perhaps they should wait, perhaps they should send word to Dragonstone, perhaps they should give Rhaenyra a chance to respond, Criston's hand would tighten on his sword. The message was clear. There would be no waiting. There would be no negotiation. There would be only action. The debate shifted. It was no longer about what Viserys had wanted. It was no longer about oaths, sworn or laws written. The debate became about who could seize power first. The Greens knew that Rhaenyra had dragons. They knew that Daemon Targaryen, her husband, was the most experienced warrior in the realm. They knew that if they gave her time, she would rally her forces and strike. The only advantage they had was speed. The only weapon they had was surprise. Otto Hightower, ever the politician, tried to frame the decision in terms of stability. He spoke of the realm's need for a strong king, of the dangers of a contested succession. But everyone in that room knew the truth. This was not about the realm. This was about power. This was about who would control the Iron Throne, and through it, the Seven Kingdoms. And so, in that windowless chamber, with the candles burning low and the night pressing in from all sides, the Green Council made its decision. They would crown Aegon II. They would do it quickly, before Rhaenyra even knew her father was dead. They would present the realm with a fait accompli, a king already crowned and anointed, and dare anyone to challenge him. Criston Cole was the one who would make it happen. He was the one who would find Prince Aegon, who had been hiding in the city, terrified of the crown he was about to receive. He was the one who would convince the reluctant prince that his sister would kill him if he did not take the throne. He was the one who would place the conqueror's crown on Aegon's head in the dragon pit, before a crowd of stunned onlookers. But all of that was still to come. For now, in the darkness of that council chamber, the die was cast. The Greens had chosen their path, and there was no turning back. The realm would bleed for this decision. The dragons would dance, and at the centre of it all, standing in the shadows with his white cloak and his cold eyes, Sir Criston Cole would be remembered as the man who made it possible. The debate had ended, the war had begun, and the only question that remained was how far Criston Cole was willing to go to ensure that his king sat the throne, and how much of his soul he was willing to sacrifice in the process. The Green Council had debated the succession into the small hours, but there was one problem they could not solve by argument alone. Prince Aegon was not waiting eagerly in the Red Keep to claim a crown. In fact, he was nowhere to be found. While Otto Hightower and the Lords of the Small Council had been discussing the legality of Viserys' final wishes, the man at the centre of their plans had slipped away. Aegon Targaryen, the king's eldest son, had vanished from the castle, and in a city where every whisper could become a blade, a missing prince was a dangerous thing. The search began quietly. Servants were questioned, guards were dispatched, and the city watch was put on alert, without being told exactly what they were looking for. But as the hours passed and the prince did not appear, the tension in the Red Keep grew thick enough to choke on. Alicent Hightower sat in her chambers with her hands folded, her face unreadable. Otto paced. and Criston Cole stood by the door, armoured and ready, waiting for orders. It was Criston who finally found him. According to the accounts that survive, the Lord Commander did not search the throne room or the council chambers. He did not look amongst the lords and ladies who had gathered for the false court that had been maintained to hide the king's death. Instead, Criston went to the places where a prince might go when he did not want to be found: the cellars, the back corridors, the forgotten rooms where the dust lay thick and the servants rarely went. And there, in a low-ceilinged chamber beneath the dragon pit, he discovered Aegon Targaryen. The prince was not alone. He had surrounded himself with the kind of company that had earned him his reputation. In the streets of Flea Bottom, there were cups on the floor and a girl in the corner, and Aegon himself was slumped against the wall, his fine clothes rumpled and his eyes unfocused. When Criston stepped into the light, the prince did not start. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply looked up, and in that look was everything the Greens had feared. Aegon did not want the crown. He had never wanted it. He had spent his whole life watching his father favour Rhaenyra, watching the realm be prepared for her rule, watching the succession be built around her name. And somewhere in that watching, he had learned a terrible lesson. He had learned that the throne was not a prize. It was a trap. It had consumed his father. It had twisted his uncle. And now they wanted to hand it to him. Criston Cole did not give him a choice. The accounts differ on exactly what was said in that room. Some say Criston spoke of duty and honour, of the oaths he had sworn and the kingdom that needed a king. Others say he spoke of something far more practical. According to one account, Criston told him that Rhaenyra would kill him and his sons if he did not act, that the Blacks would never let a rival claimant live, that the only way to protect his family was to take the crown before she could. And fear, it seems, proved more persuasive than duty. Aegon was brought before the Green conspirators in the small council chamber. He stood before them, still smelling of wine, his eyes red-rimmed and his hand shaking. He asked if his father had truly named him heir on his deathbed. Otto Hightower told him that the king's final words had been about Aegon, about the prince that was promised, about the Song of Ice and Fire. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie wrapped in enough truth to sound convincing. Viserys had spoken of Aegon the Conqueror in his final moments. He had spoken of the prophecy. It was not hard to twist those words into a blessing. Aegon looked at his mother. He looked at Criston. He looked at the lords who had gathered to put him on a throne he had never wanted, and he accepted. But the acceptance was not triumphant. It was not the moment of a prince stepping into his destiny. It was the moment of a man walking into a cage and hearing the door lock behind him. Aegon accepted the throne that would destroy his family, not because he believed in his right to rule, not because he wanted to be king, but because he was more afraid of what would happen if he refused. The coronation was arranged quickly. There was no time for the grand ceremonies that usually accompanied the crowning of a Targaryen king. The body of Viserys was still hidden away, the truth of his death still a secret held by a handful of conspirators. But the crown had to be placed, the oaths had to be sworn, and the realm had to be presented with a fait accompli before Rhaenyra could rally her supporters. And so, in the Dragon Pit, before a crowd that had been gathered in haste and confusion, Criston Cole placed the crown of Aegon the Conqueror on the head of Aegon II, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the man who had once been Rhaenyra's champion, the man who had taught her sons to fight, now crowned her enemy. The realm would never be the same. But even as the crown settled onto Aegon's brow, even as the cheers rose from the crowd, there was something hollow in the moment. The prince who had been found in a cellar, drunk and afraid, was now the king, and the king was already beginning to understand what he had agreed to. The weight of the crown was not just ceremonial. It was the weight of every choice he would have to make, every life he would have to sacrifice, every enemy he would have to destroy. And the first of those enemies was already preparing for war. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra Targaryen had not yet heard the news. She did not know that her father was dead. She did not know that her brother had been crowned. She did not know that the men who had once sworn to protect her had turned against her. But she would learn soon enough. And when she did, the dragons would take to the sky. The dance of the dragons had begun. The reluctant prince had been found, dragged from the shadows of the Red Keep and brought before the Green Council. Aegon Targaryen, the firstborn son of King Viserys, stood before his mother and her allies, his face pale, his eyes darting between them as if searching for an escape that did not exist. He had never wanted this. He had never prepared for this. And yet, the weight of a crown was already pressing down upon him before it had ever touched his brow. The council had debated through the night. Some argued for Rhaenyra, citing the king's final words. Others insisted that the Iron Throne could not pass to a woman, let alone one whose sons were whispered to be bastards. But in the end, the decision was made not by law or by precedent, but by fear. Aegon was told that Rhaenyra would kill him. She would kill his children. She would burn their line from the pages of history. And so, with trembling hands and a hollow resolve, Aegon agreed to take the crown. But a coronation requires more than a willing king. It requires a stage. It requires a symbol. And it requires a man willing to place the crown upon the sovereign's head. That man was Sir Criston Cole. The morning of the coronation dawned grey and heavy over King's Landing. The city stirred beneath a sky that seemed uncertain whether to offer sunlight or rain. Word had spread through the streets that a new king would be crowned. Though few knew the full truth of what had transpired in the Red Keep, the small folk gathered in curious clusters, drawn by rumour and the promise of spectacle. They filled the streets leading to the Dragon Pit, that massive domed structure built by Maegor the Cruel, a monument to Targaryen power and the bond between dragon and rider. Inside the Dragon Pit, the air was thick with torch light and tension. The great chamber echoed with the shuffling of feet and the murmur of voices. Nobles and knights, septons and servants, all had been summoned to witness the crowning of a new king. The benches were filled with those who had chosen their side, or who had simply been told where to stand. And at the centre of it all, upon a raised dais, stood Aegon Targaryen. He wore a black tunic, embroidered with the three-headed dragon of his house, for his posture betrayed no confidence. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped tightly before him. He looked less like a king, and more like a prisoner awaiting sentence. Beside him stood Queen Alicent, her face a mask of serene determination. And behind them both, in the place of honour, stood Sir Criston Cole. Criston had not slept. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw tight, but his hands were steady. In his grasp, he held the crown of Aegon the Conqueror. It was a simple circlet of Valyrian steel, set with rubies the size of a child's thumbnail. It had been worn by the first Aegon when he united the Seven Kingdoms, by Maegor when he crushed the Faith Militant, by Jaehaerys when he brought peace to the realm. Now it would be placed upon the head of a reluctant boy who had never wanted to rule. The crowd fell silent as Criston stepped forward. His armour gleamed in the torchlight, the white cloak of the Kingsguard draped across his shoulders. He had served as Lord Commander for years, had sworn to protect the king and his blood, but the king was dead and the blood was divided. And in that moment, Criston made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He raised the crown high, letting the rubies catch the light, letting the crowd see what was about to happen. Then, with deliberate care, he lowered it onto Aegon's head. The crown settled into place. Aegon flinched as if struck, and then, from the gathered crowd, a single voice called out. Then another, then a chorus. Aegon II, long live the king. The words echoed through the Dragon Pit, reverberating off the stone walls, spilling out into the streets beyond. The small folk outside took up the cry. Though they did not fully understand what they were celebrating, they cheered for a new king, for a new beginning, for the promise of stability in uncertain times. They did not know that they were cheering for the opening of a wound that would bleed for years. And as the cheers washed over him, Criston Cole stepped back. He had done what he had set out to do. He had crowned a king, but in that single gesture, he had also earned a name that would follow him through history. From that day forward, he would be known not just as Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. He would be known as Criston the Kingmaker. It was a title that carried both glory and infamy. A kingmaker is one who elevates a ruler, who shapes the destiny of a realm with a single act. But a kingmaker is also one who breaks the old order, who defies the established succession, who sets in motion events that cannot be undone. Criston had done all of that. By crowning Aegon, he had turned a succession dispute into open rebellion against Rhaenyra. There was no going back. The realm would now be divided into two camps: the Blacks, who supported Rhaenyra, and the Greens, who supported Aegon, and the war between them would be called the Dance of the Dragons. But why did Criston do it? The question has haunted historians and storytellers for generations. Some say he was motivated by ambition, that he saw in Aegon a king he could control, a puppet whose strings he could pull. Others say he was driven by revenge, that his hatred for Rhaenyra, born from her rejection of him, had festered into something dark and consuming. Still others argue that he genuinely believed in the cause of male primogeniture, that he thought a true-born son should rule over a woman, no matter what the old king had decreed. The truth is likely a mixture of all these things. Criston was a man of contradictions. He was a common-born knight who had risen to the highest ranks of the Kingsguard. Yet he was bound by a code of honour that he himself had broken. He had sworn to protect the king's chosen heir, yet he had helped set that heir aside. He had once been Rhaenyra's champion, her heart-brother, the man she trusted above all others, and now he was her enemy, the architect of her downfall. In the days that followed the coronation, the Green Council moved quickly to consolidate power. Messengers were sent to the great houses of Westeros, demanding fealty to King Aegon II. Riders rode for the north, the Riverlands, the Vale and the Reach, carrying letters sealed with the golden dragon of the Greens. But the responses were not what they had hoped. Many lords remained loyal to Rhaenyra, citing the king's final wishes. Others chose to wait, to see which side would prove stronger before committing their banners. Criston, now more than ever, was at the centre of the storm. He had been appointed Hand of the King, replacing Otto Hightower, whose cautious counsel had grown tiresome to Aegon. The new Hand was a warrior, not a politician. He believed in action, in decisive strikes, in the power of the sword, and he would soon have the chance to prove it. But before the war could truly begin, there was one more task that needed to be completed. Aegon had been crowned in the Dragon Pit, but his coronation was not yet complete. The traditions of the Seven Kingdoms required that a king also be anointed by the faith of the Seven, and so, on the following day, Aegon processed through the streets of King's Landing to the Great Sept of Baelor, where the High Septon himself placed the holy oils upon his brow. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, but the cheers were thin in places. Some faces were sullen, some eyes were watchful. The small folk of King's Landing had seen kings come and go. They knew that a crown did not guarantee peace, and they knew that across the narrow sea, on Dragonstone, a woman named Rhaenyra was receiving word of what had happened. She would not let it stand. And so the stage was set. The king had been made. The rebellion had begun. And the man who had placed the crown upon his head, Criston Cole, would now have to live with the consequences of his choice. The name Kingmaker would follow him to his grave and beyond. But it was not a name he had sought. It was a name he had earned, one act at a time, one betrayal at a time, one crown at a time. The war that followed would be brutal. It would consume dragons and lords and common men alike. It would leave the realm scarred and bleeding. And at the heart of it all, there would be a man in white fighting for a cause he had chosen, bound to a king he had made, and haunted by a woman he had once loved. News of Aegon's coronation reaches Rhaenyra on Dragonstone at the worst possible moment. She is in the birthing bed, labouring through a child that will not survive. The maester's hands are busy with her, and the Raven's message arrives cold and final. Aegon has been crowned in the Dragon Pit. Criston Cole placed the Conqueror's crown upon his head. The Greens have moved, and they have moved decisively. Rhaenyra's body is failing her, and her kingdom is being stolen while she bleeds. The child is born dead. A girl, they say, though she never draws breath. Rhaenyra holds her for a moment, and then she lets the maester take her away. There is no time for mourning. The throne of her father has been seized, and the man who once swore to protect her is now the architect of her destruction. Daemon is at her side, and his fury is cold and controlled. He tells her what must be done. She must answer. She must be crowned, and she must do it now, before the realm forgets that Viserys ever named her heir. The Blacks crown Rhaenyra in answer, and the realm is divided between two rival monarchs. The ceremony is not held in the Dragon Pit. There is no grand procession through the streets of King's Landing. Instead, Rhaenyra is crowned on Dragonstone, in the ancient hall of the Targaryen fortress, with only her closest supporters in attendance. Daemon places the crown upon her head. It is the same crown her father wore, a simple band of Valyrian steel set with rubies. She does not smile. She does not weep. She accepts it as a duty, not a triumph. The ravens fly from Dragonstone to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. They carry Rhaenyra's claim, a declaration that Aegon is a usurper and that she is the rightful queen. But the Greens have sent their own ravens, and the lords of Westeros must choose. Some remember the oath they swore to Viserys. Others see a woman on a throne and a man who can lead armies. Old loyalties fracture, new alliances form. The great houses draw their lines, and the realm is split down the middle. Dragons, great houses and old grudges are drawn into a conflict neither side can fully control. The Blacks have more dragons, but the Greens have the capital, the treasury, and the crown. Rhaenyra commands the loyalty of the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale. Aegon holds the Reach, the Stormlands, and the Westerlands. Dawn stays out of it as Dawn always does. But the dragons do not care for borders. They are weapons of mass destruction, and once they are unleashed, there is no calling them back. Criston's personal war against Rhaenyra has become a continental catastrophe. What began as a broken heart and a bruised ego has spiraled into a conflict that will consume entire bloodlines. He is no longer just the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. He is the Kingmaker, the hand of the king, the man who convinced a reluctant prince to take a throne he never wanted. And now he must defend that throne against the woman he once loved. Every battle that follows, every city that burns, every dragon that falls from the sky, it all traces back to him. The war has not yet begun in earnest, but the pieces are moving. Rhaenyra sends her sons to secure alliances. Daemon begins gathering sellswords and planning strikes. On the green side, Criston prepares the defences of King's Landing. Knowing that the Blacks will come for the capital, he trains the city watch, fortifies the walls and waits. The calm before the storm is brief, and it is filled with the sound of ravens' wings. The first blood of the war is not drawn by dragonfire, but by a blade in the dark. Lucerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's second son, is sent to Storm's End to secure the loyalty of Lord Boros Baratheon. It is a desperate gambit, a boy of 14 flying alone on his young dragon Arax to treat with a man who has already pledged his sword to the Greens. But Rhaenyra needs allies, and she sends her children where she cannot go herself. Lucerys arrives in the midst of a storm, both literal and political. The Great Hall of Storm's End is lit by torches that flicker with the wind, and standing at Lord Baratheon's side is Aemon Targaryen, the Green Prince, mounted on Vargar, the largest living dragon in the world. The challenge is immediate. Aemon demands Lucerys's eye, a blood price for an old wound, a childhood maiming that has festered into a grown man's obsession. Lucerys refuses. Lord Baratheon offers no protection. The boy must leave, and he must leave quickly. He takes to the sky on Arax, hoping to outrun the storm and the danger, but Aemon follows. The chase over Shipbreaker Bay is short and brutal. Vargar is ancient and massive, a living weapon of conquest, and Arax is barely more than a hatchling in comparison. The young dragon tries to defend his rider, breathing flame into the older dragon's face, but it only enrages the beast. Vhagar snaps Arrax in two with a single bite. Lucerys falls into the churning sea, and he does not rise again. The news reaches Dragonstone before dawn. Rhaenyra's scream is heard throughout the fortress. She does not weep for her father's crown now. She weeps for her son, and her grief turns to something harder, something colder. Daemon finds her in the nursery, holding the empty cradle where her stillborn daughter never lay. He does not offer comfort, he offers vengeance, and Rhaenyra accepts. The war that was fought with ravens and declarations is now fought with fire and blood. The first casualty is a prince, and the second is mercy itself. The Blacks begin their campaign in earnest. Daemon takes to the sky on Caraxes, the bloodworm, and he does not fly alone. Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, mounts Meleys, the Red Queen. Together, they strike at the heart of green power. They burn the armies gathering in the Reach. They lay waste to supply lines. They remind the realm that dragons do not negotiate. On the green side, Criston Cole knows he cannot match the Blacks in the air. He has fewer dragons, and his riders are less experienced. But he has something else, strategy. He knows that dragons are not invincible. They can be killed if you are willing to pay the price. He begins planning the defences of King's Landing, not with walls and gates, but with scorpions and nets, with traps and ambushes. He trains his men to aim for the eyes, for the wings, for the soft bellies of the beasts, and he waits for the Blacks to make a mistake. The war is no longer a question of who has the better claim. It is a question of who is willing to go further, to burn brighter, to sacrifice more. Rhaenyra has lost a son, Aegon has lost his innocence, and the dragons are hungry. The realm now had two crowned monarchs, Rhaenyra on Dragonstone, Aegon in King's Landing. The dance of the dragons was no longer a whispered threat. It was a living, bleeding reality, and at the centre of it all, standing just behind the new king's throne, was Criston Cole. For the first weeks of the war, the Greens were guided by Otto Hightower. The hand of the king was a man of careful calculation, of letters and alliances, of patience. He believed the war would be won not by the sword alone, but by swaying the great houses, by starving Rhaenyra of support, by letting time work against her. But Aegon was not a patient man. He had been crowned against his will, and now that he wore the crown, he wanted to feel its power. He wanted victories. He wanted his enemies to bleed. And as the war worsened, as news arrived of houses declaring for Rhaenyra, as the black dragon banners began appearing across the riverlands and the north, Aegon grew dissatisfied with Otto's caution. The old hand's diplomacy felt like delay. His careful letters felt like weakness. The king wanted action, and he found a kindred spirit in Criston Cole. Criston had always been a man of direct action. He had risen from common birth through skill with a blade, not through whispered counsel in shadowed chambers. He understood violence. He understood loyalty, and he understood that in a war between dragons, hesitation could mean annihilation. When Aegon began to voice his frustration, Criston was there to listen. When Otto urged restraint, Criston urged the opposite. It did not take long for the king to make his choice. Otto Hightower was dismissed as Hand of the King, sent away from the small council, his influence broken, and in his place, Criston Cole was raised to the highest office a common-born man could ever hold. He became the king's hand. Think about what that meant. Criston Cole, the son of a steward, a boy from the Dornish Marches who had no claim to blood or title, now stood as the second most powerful man in the realm. He had been Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, a position of immense honour. But Hand of the King was something else entirely. It was the power to command armies, to set policy, to shape the very course of the war, and Criston intended to use that power. His approach was simple. He favoured swift violence, hard marches, the destruction of enemy support before the enemy could gather strength. He did not believe in sieges that dragged on for months, in negotiations that gave the Blacks time to rally. He believed in striking fast, striking hard, and leaving nothing behind that could be used against the Greens. He began by directing the Green military campaigns personally. He took to the field, not as a commander who sat safely in a tent, but as a knight who rode at the head of his men. He led columns of soldiers through the riverlands, through the crown lands, wherever the black banners flew. He burned villages that harboured Rhaenyra's supporters. He hanged lords who had sworn for the blacks. He marched his armies through the night, pushing his men to exhaustion, because he believed that the war would be won by whoever was willing to endure the most. And in many ways, he was right. The early campaigns of the Greens under Criston Cole were brutal and effective. He caught black forces off guard. He seized key positions before they could be reinforced. He made the Riverlands a graveyard for those who opposed the king. His reputation grew, not just as a warrior, but as a commander who would not stop, who would not rest, who would burn the entire realm if that was what it took to put Aegon securely on the throne. But there was a cost. The common-born knight had reached the summit of royal power. He stood in the Red Keep as the king's hand, with armies at his command and the king's ear. Yet the realm burned beneath him. Every village he burned, every lord he hanged, every hard march he ordered, it all fed the fire. The blacks did not surrender. They grew more determined. Rhaenyra's supporters did not scatter. They gathered, they fortified, they prepared for the next battle. Criston Cole had become the architect of the Green War effort, but the war itself was becoming something he could not fully control. The dragons were waking, the great houses were choosing sides, and the violence he had unleashed was spreading faster than any army could march. He stood at the height of his power, a common-born knight who had risen higher than any of his station had any right to dream. But the crown he served was fragile, the king he advised was unstable, and the war he directed was consuming everything in its path. The realm was burning, and Criston Cole was the one holding the torch. The Riverlands were a tapestry of shifting loyalties, and Criston Cole was about to learn that a tapestry can be cut to ribbons as easily as it can be woven. He had served as Hand of the King, a title that carried the weight of the crown. But now he was taking the field as a commander. The war could not be won from a council chamber, and Aegon's patience for Otto Hightower's cautious diplomacy had worn thin. So Criston led armies through the Riverlands, where every road was a gamble and every lord a potential traitor. The Riverlands had always been a battleground. Its geography made it a crossroads, a place where armies marched and countermarched, where fields were burned and villages emptied. But this war was different. The dance of the dragons had split houses down the middle. Brothers fought brothers, and fathers disowned sons. In the Riverlands, the Blackwood stood with Rhaenyra, while the Brackens declared for Aegon, and between them, 100 smaller houses watched and waited, ready to switch sides the moment the wind changed. Criston understood the necessity of speed and discipline. He had trained men for years, first as a knight of the Kingsguard, then as a commander. He knew that a well-ordered column could march faster than a disorganized mob, that a shield wall held against a charge, that a feigned retreat could draw an enemy into a trap. These were the lessons of the training yard and the battlefield, and he trusted them. But the Riverlands were not a training yard. They were a web of old grudges and new ambitions, and every victory he won seemed to create two new enemies. He took castles, he burned supply depots, he forced lords to bend the knee, but each success was temporary. A castle could be retaken, a depot could be rebuilt. A lord who swore fealty today might raise his banners for Rhaenyra tomorrow. Criston's victories could not solve the greater problem. The war was ruled by dragons and fractured alliances. He could win every battle on the ground, but as long as Rhaenyra's dragons flew, the war remained unwinnable, and the dragons were not the only threats. The Riverlands themselves seemed to conspire against him. The roads were muddy, the rivers swollen, the forests thick with ambushes. His scouts reported enemy movements that vanished into mist. His supply lines were harried by small bands of riders who melted away before he catch them. The land bled his army slowly, like a wound that would not close. Criston's confidence rested on discipline and battlefield skill. He had fought in melees and tourneys, had faced Daemon Targaryen in the lists, and knocked Dark Sister from his hand. He believed that a well-trained soldier could overcome any obstacle, that courage and steel were enough. But war punishes certainty. It rewards flexibility, patience, and the willingness to adapt. Criston was a warrior, not a politician. He saw the war as a series of battles to be won, not a web of alliances to be maintained. And the Riverlands were teaching him a hard lesson. As losses mounted, even Criston's formidable reputation could not protect him from isolation. The lords who rode with him began to whisper. They had followed the Kingmaker because he was the hand of the king, because he had placed the crown on Aegon's head. But now, as the campaign dragged on, they wondered if he was leading them to victory or to ruin. The Riverlands were a graveyard for armies, and every day they spent marching through its fields brought them closer to that fate. Criston felt the isolation. He had always been a man apart, a common-born knight among nobles, a Kingsguard who had broken his oath. But now even his own men seemed distant. They obeyed his orders, but they did not trust his judgment. They saw the empty supply wagons, weary soldiers, the endless marches. They saw that the war was not ending, that it was only beginning, and yet Criston pressed on. He had no choice. The war had to be won, and he was the only one who could win it. He would take the Riverlands, castle by castle, field by field, until every lord bent the knee to Aegon. He would prove that the Kingmaker was also the king's sword. But the Riverlands were patient. They had seen conquerors before. They had seen armies come and go. They knew that winter was coming, and that the land would outlast any man who tried to hold it. The campaign wore on. Criston's army grew smaller, his supplies thinner, his victories more hollow. He took a castle, only to learn that Rhaenyra's dragons had burned a green stronghold 100 miles away. He forced a lord to swear fealty, only to hear that the same lord had sent secret messages to Dragonstone. The war was a hydra, and every head he cut off grew 2 more. But Criston did not stop. He could not stop. He was the Kingmaker, and the Kingmaker did not retreat. He would march until the Riverlands were his, or until the Riverlands swallowed him whole. And as he marched, he began to understand that the war was not about battles. It was about endurance. It was about who could hold on longer, who could suffer more, who could watch their world burn and still keep fighting. The Riverlands were teaching him that lesson, one muddy road at a time, and the lesson was not over. There were still more roads to march, more castles to take, more lords to bend. The war was far from finished, and the next road would lead him deeper into the heart of the conflict, where the dragons waited, and the alliances grew even more tangled. But that was a story for another night. For now the Kingmaker marched on, alone in a land that would never be his. The Riverlands had become a graveyard of strategy. Criston Cole, the Kingmaker, the hand of the king, the finest knight of his age, found himself leading a campaign that was slowly bleeding him dry. He had won battles. He had taken castles. He had forced lords to bend the knee to Aegon II. But none of it was enough. The war was not being decided by marches and sieges. It was being decided by dragons, and the Blacks had more of them. Criston understood this, even if he would never say it aloud. He had spent his entire life believing that skill with a sword, discipline, and courage could overcome any obstacle. That was the code of the knight. That was the truth he had built his identity upon. But the Dance of the Dragons was not a war of knights. It was a war of fire and blood, and the men on the ground were merely pieces being moved toward an inevitable end. Near the end of his campaign, Criston found himself trapped by black forces in the Riverlands. The loyalties of the River Lords had shifted like the currents had trident, and what had once been a path of conquest had become a cage. His army was exhausted, his supply lines stretched thin, and the enemy was closing in from multiple directions. The Blacks had learned from their earlier mistakes. They no longer met Criston in open battle, where his tactical mind could outmaneuver them. Instead, they harried his flanks, burned his provisions, and tightened the noose one skirmish at a time. Criston knew what was coming. He had seen enough battles to recognize the shape of defeat, but he was not the kind of man who would run. And he was certainly not the kind of man who would surrender. If he was going to die, he would die as he had lived, with a sword in his hand and the white cloak of the Kingsguard upon his shoulders. He would make his death mean something. He would make it a story that bards would sing for generations. Facing defeat, he sought the honourable single combat expected of a famous knight. This was the ancient tradition of Westeros, the way warriors of renown had settled their disputes since the time of the first men. A champion from each side would meet in the field, and the gods would judge the outcome. It was clean, it was noble, it was the death that Criston Cole deserved. He rode out before the enemy lines, his white cloak billowing in the wind, his armour polished to a gleam despite the mud and blood of the campaign. He called for a champion to face him. He offered his life in exchange for the lives of his men, a final act of honour from a man who had spent his entire career trying to prove that honour was not reserved for the highborn. But the Blacks were not interested in honour. They were interested in victory. The men who surrounded Criston were not Knights of the Reach or Lords of the Stormlands. They were rivermen, hard and practical, who had seen too many villages burned and too many sons killed to care about the niceties of chivalric combat. They had been sent to kill Criston Cole, and they intended to do exactly that in whatever way would work. His enemies refused to grant him a glorious death or a final chance to display his skill. There would be no epic duel, no exchange of blows that would be remembered in song. There would only be the cold efficiency of men who had a job to do. Robb Rivers and 2 archers answered him with arrows. Robb was a bastard of House Blackwood, a house known for its fierce loyalty to the Blacks and its deep hatred of the Greens. He was not a famous knight. He was not a lord or a prince. He was simply a man with a bow and a clear shot, and that was enough. The first arrow struck Criston in the belly. It punched through the white steel of his armour and buried itself deep in his gut. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but Criston did not fall. He was still mounted, still gripping the reins, still trying to understand what had just happened. He had prepared himself for a sword fight. He had prepared himself for a last stand against a worthy opponent. He had not prepared himself to be shot down like a dog. The second arrow hit him in the neck. It was a cruel shot, the kind that archers practice for years to perfect. It tore through the gap between his gorget and his helm, severing arteries and flooding his throat with blood. Criston tried to speak, tried to call out a challenge or a curse or a prayer, but no words came. Only a wet, choking sound that no one would remember. The third arrow struck his breast, piercing his heart. By the time it landed, Criston Cole was already dead. He did not fall from his horse with dramatic grace. He simply slumped forward, his body held upright by the saddle and the armour that had been his pride. The white cloak, the symbol of his oath and his honour, was now stained red with his own blood. Robb Rivers and the 2 archers did not celebrate. They did not cheer or raise their bows in triumph. They simply lowered their weapons and watched as the greatest knight of the Dar died in the mud of the Riverlands, killed not by a dragon or a prince or a legendary sword, but by 3 arrows from men whose names would barely be remembered. The Butcher's Ball, as the small folk would later call it, was not a battle, it was an execution, and it marked the end of Criston Cole's long and twisted journey from the tawny grounds of Maidenpool to the blood-soaked fields of the Riverlands. He had been the kingmaker, the man who placed a crown on Aegon II's head and set the realm ablaze. He had been the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the sworn shield of kings and princes. He had been the lover and the enemy of Rhaenyra Targaryen, the man whose personal bitterness had helped tear a dynasty apart. And in the end, he was just a body in armour, lying in the mud, while the war he had started raged on without him. The news of his death would spread quickly. Some would mourn him, others would celebrate, but most would simply note that the man who had once been the most dangerous knight in Westeros had been brought down by 3 arrows and a bastard's steady hand. It was not the death he had wanted. It was not the death he had earned, but it was the death that the war gave him. And the war was far from over. With Criston gone, the Greens lost their most capable commander, their most relentless advocate, and their most visible symbol of strength. The Blacks pressed their advantage, and the Dance of the Dragons entered a new and even more brutal phase. The dragons themselves would soon take to the skies in numbers that had not been seen since the conquest. And the fate of the realm would be decided not by knights or kings, but by fire and blood and the terrible choices of those who rode the great beasts. Criston Cole calls for single combat. It is the final act of a man who has spent his entire life believing that the sword can settle any dispute, that honour can be measured in the distance between 2 warriors facing each other on an open field. He stands in the mud of the Riverlands, surrounded by the army of the Blacks, and he waits for a champion to step forward. This is how legends are supposed to end. The greatest knight of his age, facing one final opponent, trading blows until one of them falls. But the men who have him surrounded are not interested in legends. They are interested in victory. Robb Rivers is a bastard of House Blackwood, and he carries a bow. He is joined by 2 other archers, whose names history does not trouble itself to remember. They do not step forward to meet Criston Cole in honourable combat. They do not give him the death he has earned through decades of service to the crown. They simply draw their bows and loose their arrows. The first arrow strikes him in the belly, the second finds his neck, the third pierces his breast. Criston Cole dies instantly, not in a celebrated duel, but beneath arrows fired by men who deny him legend. There is no final speech. There is no last exchange of words. There is only the wet sound of iron-piercing flesh. And then the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the Hand of the King, the man who crowned Aegon II, collapses into the mud and does not rise again. This is the death that awaits even the most skilled warrior when the war has moved beyond the age of single combat. Criston Cole spent his life mastering the arts of chivalry. He trained with sword and Morningstar until his arms ached. He studied the forms and the footwork and the timing that separates a good fighter from a great one. He became one of the finest warriors of his age, feared by every man who ever faced him across a battlefield. But in the end, none of that mattered. The archers who killed him did not care about his reputation. They did not care about the tourneys he had won or the champions he had defeated. They only cared that he was an enemy commander and that a well-placed arrow would end the war for him more quickly than any duel ever could. And so the Kingmaker dies not with a sword in his hand, but with arrows in his chest. It is an inglorious end for a man who lived his entire life chasing glory. But perhaps it is also a fitting one, because Criston Cole is remembered one of the finest warriors of his age, and one of the most destructive Kingsguard in history. The 2 halves of his legacy cannot be separated. He was a man of extraordinary skill and discipline, a knight who rose from common birth to the highest ranks of the realm through nothing but his own ability. But he was also a man who let his wounded pride curdle into something dark and dangerous, a man who used his position to destroy the very dynasty he had sworn to protect. His life embodies the best of chivalry's discipline and the worst of its wounded pride. When he was young, he believed in the oaths he swore. He believed that a knight's word was his bond, that honour was worth more than gold, that the Kingsguard existed to serve the realm and protect the innocent. But somewhere along the way, that belief became twisted. The rejection he suffered at the hands of Rhaenyra Targaryen did not just break his heart, it broke his faith in the entire system he had dedicated his life to. If the princess he loved could cast him aside, if the oaths he swore could be broken so easily by those above him, then why should he continue to honour them? Why should he be the only one playing by the rules? And so he became the Kingmaker. He placed Aegon II on the Iron Throne, and in doing so, he unleashed a war that would consume the Targaryen dynasty from within. The Kingmaker's greatest triumph, placing Aegon II on the throne, helps unleash the ruin of House Targaryen. It is a terrible irony. Criston Cole spent his entire career serving the crown, protecting the royal family, fighting to preserve the stability of the realm. And yet his single greatest act, the act that earned him his infamous title, was the act that tore the realm apart. He did not mean to destroy the Targaryens. He meant to save them from what he saw as the illegitimacy of Rhaenyra's claim. But the war he started did not end with a clear victory for either side. It ended with dragons dead, with princes slaughtered, with a dynasty so weakened that it would never fully recover. In the years after his death, historians would debate his motives. Was he driven by ambition, by revenge, by a genuine belief in the rights of male inheritance? The truth is probably a mixture of all three. Criston Cole was a complex man, capable of great loyalty and great cruelty, often at the same time. He could teach a child to fight with a sword and then kill a man at a wedding feast. He could crown a king with one hand and order the deaths of his enemies with the other. He was not a simple villain, nor was he a simple hero. He was something more dangerous. He was a man who believed utterly in his own righteousness, even when his actions led to the destruction of everything he claimed to serve. The Riverlands swallowed his body, and the war continued without him. The Blacks and the Greens would go on fighting, killing, burning, until the realm was reduced to ash and tears. But Criston Cole was already gone. His story ended by 3 arrows from men who would never be remembered by name. It is a quiet end for a man who lived so loudly, but perhaps that is the final lesson of his life. No matter how skilled you are, no matter how high you rise, no matter how many crowns you place on how many heads, the world does not owe you a legendary death. Sometimes you just fall in the mud, and the war moves on without you, and so the Kingmaker passes into history, a figure of contradiction and tragedy. He was the finest knight of his age, and he was the man who broke the realm. He was the protector of the crown, and he was the architect of its ruin. He was Criston Cole, the common-born boy from the Dornish Marches who rose higher than anyone could have imagined, and who fell so hard that the ground still trembles from the impact. The arrows that killed him did not just end his life, they ended an era. The age of the knight, the age of chivalry, the age of single combat and tawny glory was already dying. Criston Cole was just the last man to believe it could still be saved.